Tonight, we begin with a simple question that will haunt you by morning. What if everything you owned, every comfort you take for granted, every moment of leisure you enjoy, was built on the broken bodies of people who worked themselves to death before they turned 30? Picture this. It's 1853. You're standing outside a massive brick building in Manchester, England, and the sound coming from inside isn't machinery. It's screaming metal and human suffering blended into one continuous roar that you'll hear in your nightmares for the rest of your very short life. You've just been hired at one of Victoria's finest cotton mills, and congratulations, you've essentially signed your own death warrant with an ink-stained thumbprint because you can't read the contract that just sold your body to industrial capitalism. Let's be clear right from the start. There is no romance here. No Dickensian redemption arc. No plucky orphan who makes good through hard work and determination. That's a lie we told ourselves later to cope with the guilt of building an empire on mass suffering. The reality? You're about to enter a building where children lose fingers to machines before they lose their baby teeth. Where the air is so thick with cotton fibers that breathing feels like drowning on land. Where your 12 to 16-hour shifts will be spent in temperatures exceeding 100 degrees because humidity helps keep the thread from breaking, which is apparently more important than keeping you from breaking. You look down at your clothes, probably the only outfit you own, and realize they'll be soaked through with sweat, blood, and machine oil within the first hour. And you'll wear them like that for 6 days straight because Sunday's your only day off. And you'll spend that day too exhausted to do anything but sleep and maybe attend a church service where you'll be told that your suffering is God's will and that good Christians don't complain about their station in life. The factory whistle screams at 5 in the morning. And if you're not inside when those doors close, you don't get paid for the day, which means you don't eat for the day, which means you might not survive the day because you're already operating on the edge of starvation with a diet that consists primarily of bread, weak tea, and occasionally some cheese if you've been particularly lucky or thrifty. You notice the other workers shuffling in, and they all have this same hollow-eyed look, this 1,000-yard stare that you'll develop within a week. The look of someone who knows exactly how their story ends, but has to keep turning the pages anyway, because the alternative is dying faster in the workhouse or on the streets. Children, some as young as 5 years old, rush past you with a desperate energy because they know the overseers favor speed over safety. And the parents bringing them aren't monsters. They're just trapped in a system where your children's labor is the only thing, standing between your family and complete destitution. The building looms above you. 7 stories of brick and smoke and suffering. And every window is kept tightly closed despite the heat, because the cotton fibers must stay humid, and the workers' comfort is never part of the equation in industrial efficiency. You can smell it from here. Machine oil, human sweat, raw sewage from the overflowing privies, coal smoke, and something else. Something sweet and rotten that you'll later learn is the smell of infected wounds that workers can't afford to treat and employers won't pay to address. This is your life now, every single day. No weekends except Sunday, no holidays except Christmas, if the owner is feeling particularly generous or fears social unrest. No sick days, because illness is weakness, and weakness doesn't deserve wages. No safety regulations, because Parliament hasn't figured out yet that maybe letting industrialists work people to death without consequence might be bad for society in the long run. Welcome to the Industrial Revolution. where progress is measured in productivity and human life is the cheapest resource in the entire production chain, cheaper than coal, cheaper than raw cotton, cheaper than the machines themselves, because machines are expensive to replace. And workers, well, there's always another desperate soul waiting outside those gates, willing to take your place for a penny less per day. If you'd like more stories like this one, please subscribe so you don't miss any new uploads. I'd also love to hear from you. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time of day you're tuning in. The gates slam shut behind you with a finality that feels like a prison door closing. And you realize with creeping horror that this comparison isn't metaphorical. You literally can't leave this building for the next 12 to 16 hours regardless of what happens to you. Regardless of whether you're injured, sick, or dying, because the doors are locked from the outside and the overseers have the only keys. A safety measure they claim prevents theft, but really just prevents workers from escaping their contracted hours. You're herded up narrow wooden stairs that are slick with years of accumulated oil and God knows what else. Stairs that have no railings because railings cost money and workers' safety doesn't generate profit. Stairs where at least 3 people have fallen to their deaths this year alone. But the factory owner simply hired replacements the next day and never bothered to install basic safety features because the cost of your life is less than the cost of iron railings. The sound grows louder as you climb, that mechanical screaming that seems to come from everywhere at once. A cacophony of belt-driven machinery, spinning jennies, power looms, and human voices trying desperately to communicate over the industrial thunder that will leave you partially deaf within 5 years and completely deaf within 10 if you survive that long. You reach the 3rd floor, your assigned station, and the heat hits you like walking into a physical wall. The temperature is already approaching 90 degrees at 5:30 in the morning and will climb to well over 100 by midday. And you understand now why all the windows are closed. It's not just about humidity for the cotton. It's about creating an environment so hostile that only the most desperate will accept these conditions, which is exactly the workforce they want. People with absolutely no other options. The overseer, a thick-necked man with a cane that he uses liberally on anyone who slows their pace or questions his authority, assigns you to a power loom, one of 12 massive machines in your row, each one operated by a single worker who must remain standing for the entire shift because sitting is not permitted, even for a moment, because sitting suggests laziness, and laziness is theft of company time. He shows you once, only once, how to thread the bobbins, how to restart the machine when thread breaks, how to reach into the moving machinery to clear jams. And he does this demonstration in under 3 minutes because training costs time and time costs money. And you'll either figure it out or you'll be replaced by someone who will. Those are your only 2 options in this equation. The loom starts with a violence that makes you jump. Metal parts screaming into motion, belts whipping overhead connected to a massive steam engine somewhere in the bowels of this building. A steam engine that could explode at any moment because safety inspections don't exist and maintenance is performed only when machines break down completely. Never preventatively, because prevention costs money today, whereas explosion might cost money tomorrow, and tomorrow's problems are tomorrow's concerns. Within minutes, your hands are moving automatically, threading, watching, clearing, restarting, a rhythm that will become so ingrained in your muscle memory that you'll mime these motions in your sleep. That you'll wake up reaching for phantom threads, that you'll never fully escape even decades later if you somehow survive to see decades later. The cotton fibers are everywhere, floating in the air like a blizzard that never ends, getting in your eyes, your nose, your mouth, your lungs, coating every surface, including your skin, until you look like a ghost, a specter of industrial progress, and with every breath you're inhaling thousands of these microscopic fibers that will accumulate in your lungs, scarring the tissue, reducing your capacity to breathe. A condition that will later be called bicyanosis or brown lung disease. But right now, it's just called the price of employment. You glance around at your fellow workers and notice something disturbing. There are no old people here. The oldest worker you can see looks maybe 40, but is probably 30. Everyone else appears to be teenagers or younger. And you realize this isn't because old people don't need work. It's because people don't get old in places like this. They die or become so disabled that they're discarded long before they reach what should be middle age. A child, maybe 7 years old, darts between the machines. Her job is to crawl underneath the running looms, to collect fallen cotton, to squeeze into spaces where adults don't fit. And you watch in horror as she navigates this forest of fast-moving mechanical death with a casualness that suggests she's been doing this for years, which she probably has. Because child labor isn't just permitted, it's preferred. Children are smaller, more obedient, cheaper. And when they're inevitably injured or killed, they're easier to replace than expensive machinery. The first hour passes in a blur of mechanical motion and growing panic as you realize you have no idea what you're doing, and the overseer has already moved on to terrorize other workers. And every time your thread breaks, which is constantly because you haven't developed the touch yet, you have to reach into the moving loom to fix it. Your hands darting between metal parts that could crush your fingers to paste or tear them clean off if your timing is wrong by even a fraction of a second. You watch the woman next to you perform this dance with casual grace, her hands moving so fast they blur. And you notice she's missing the tip of her left index finger and part of her right thumb. Old injuries that have healed into gnarled stumps. And she catches you staring and laughs bitterly, shouting over the machinery that she's one of the lucky ones because she still has enough fingers left to work. The noise is physically painful, a constant assault on your ears that makes your head throb and your teeth ache. And you understand now why everyone's lips are moving, but you can't hear what they're saying. They're not actually trying to communicate through sound anymore. They're reading lips and using hand signals, a language of survival that evolved because human voices simply cannot compete with the violence of industrial machinery. Your feet begin to hurt within the first 2 hours, a deep, aching pain that starts in your soles and radiates up through your calves, your knees, your lower back, and you shift your weight from foot to foot trying to find relief, but there is no relief. There is only the growing understanding that you will stand here for at least 10 more hours, and possibly 14, if the overseer decides the day's quota hasn't been met. Which he frequently does because quotas are deliberately set impossibly high to justify extended hours and reduced per-piece wages. You need to use the privy, desperately. But you learned during the brief morning instruction that workers are allowed 2 privy breaks per day, 1 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon, each lasting no more than 5 minutes. And if you take longer than 5 minutes, your wages are docked. And if you need to go outside those designated times, you simply have to hold it or risk soiling yourself. Which some workers do, especially the children who don't have the physical capacity to wait 6-hour intervals between bathroom breaks. And the humiliation of standing in your own waste while you work is just another indignity in a mountain of indignities that defines factory life. The cotton dust is getting worse, coating your throat, making every swallow painful. And you develop a cough that everyone around you also has. A constant hacking chorus that punctuates the mechanical rhythm. And you'll learn that this cough never goes away. It becomes part of your body's new normal. A permanent reminder of what you're sacrificing for 3 shillings a week. Which sounds like money until you realize it's barely enough to rent a corner in a shared room and buy enough bread to not starve. Assuming you don't get fined for being late, or for damaged work, or for talking, or for any of the dozen arbitrary infractions that overseers use to reduce your actual take-home pay to almost nothing. A child screams somewhere behind you, a sound that cuts through even the mechanical roar. And you turn to see a boy of maybe 9 clutching his hand, blood pouring between his fingers, and the overseer rushes over not to help him, but to shut down the machine, examining it for damage, and only after confirming the loom is fine does he grab the boy by his good arm and drag him toward the stairs, shouting that the boy better be back tomorrow or his whole family will be dismissed. And you realize with sickening clarity that this child's injury, possibly the loss of several fingers, is treated as an inconvenience to production rather than a human tragedy. The woman next to you hasn't even looked up from her work during this incident. Her hands continue their blur of motion. And you understand that she's seen this happen so many times that it no longer registers as remarkable. Just another Tuesday in the factory. Just another child learning the true cost of industrial progress through permanent disfigurement. You look down at your own hands, still whole, still complete, and wonder how long they'll stay that way. Because the mathematics of probability are not in your favor. Every worker here will eventually be injured. It's not a question of if, but when. And the severity is just luck. Just a roll of dice that determines whether you lose a fingertip or your entire hand, whether you can return to work or whether you'll be thrown out to beg on the streets or die in the workhouse. Your machine jams again, and your hands reach into the moving parts automatically now. Muscle memory already forming after just 3 hours, and you feel the heat of the metal, the whisper of moving belts past your skin, and you pull back just in time as the shuttle snaps forward with enough force to break bone. 4 hours into your shift, someone finally signals the breakfast break. 15 minutes of mercy that feels like a cruel joke, because 15 minutes is barely enough time to descend 3 flights of those treacherous stairs, eat whatever mager food you brought, use the privy if you can fight through the line of 50 other workers with the same idea, and then climb back up before the overseer starts docking wages for tardiness. You join the stampede downward, workers pushing and shoving with desperate urgency because every second counts. And you emerge into a small courtyard behind the factory where the air, while still heavy with coal smoke and industrial waste, feels like pure mountain oxygen compared to the suffocating atmosphere inside. You pull out your breakfast, a hunk of stale bread, and a piece of hard cheese that you've been carrying in your pocket where it's absorbed the delightful flavors of machine oil and sweat. And you eat it anyway because hunger has a way of making quality irrelevant. Because your body is burning calories at an unsustainable rate. And this bread and cheese might be the only thing keeping you conscious until the midday break. If there is a midday break, which isn't guaranteed because break times are technically at the discretion of management, and management's discretion is usually informed by profit margins rather than human needs. The privy situation is worse than you imagined. There are only 4 wooden outhouses for a workforce of over 200 people. and the line stretches across the courtyard. And you do the math and realize that even if each person takes only 2 minutes, which is optimistic, you'll never make it through the line in the remaining time. So you make the calculation that millions of workers make every day. You sacrifice bladder relief for the certainty of not losing wages. You choose discomfort over destitution, because that's what poverty does. It forces you to make impossible choices between basic human dignity and basic economic survival. You notice the factory owner's son walking through the courtyard, a young man dressed in fine clothes who's apparently touring the family business. And he's covering his nose with a handkerchief as he surveys his father's empire. And the contrast between his disgust at the smell and your complete desensitization to it speaks volumes about the different worlds you inhabit despite occupying the same physical space. He sees squalor and thinks it unfortunate. You see it and think it's Tuesday? That's the difference between visiting hell and living there. The break ends with a whistle that sends everyone scrambling back inside. And you climb those stairs again with legs that are already trembling, muscles already depleted, knowing you have at least 8 more hours of this, probably more. And the woman who was next to you earlier isn't there anymore. She's been moved to a different section, and your new neighbor is a girl who can't be older than 12, and she's working 2 looms simultaneously, her small hands flying between machines with terrifying speed and confidence. And when you gesture to ask how long she's been doing this, she holds up 7 fingers, meaning she's been working in factories since she was 5 years old. Half her life spent in this industrial nightmare. And this is normal. This is just how the world works for people like you, like her, like everyone in this building who wasn't born into wealth. The afternoon heat becomes truly unbearable. The temperature inside must be over 100 degrees now. And workers are dropping, not dying, but fainting, collapsing where they stand, and the overseers just drag them aside, prop them up in corners, pour water on their faces if they're feeling generous. And if they wake up, they're expected to return to their machines immediately. And if they don't wake up quickly enough, they're carried out, and their position is given to someone else. Because there's always someone else. Always another desperate soul willing to trade their body's destruction for a few shillings a week. Your hands are bleeding now. Small cuts from sharp metal edges, from cotton bolls that are somehow abrasive enough to split skin. And you have no bandages, no medical supplies, nothing but maybe some spit and a wipe on your already filthy clothes. And you watch these small wounds collect cotton fibers and machine oil, and probably bacteria that will lead to infection, because factory workers have an infection rate that would horrify modern sensibilities, but is just accepted as normal in 1853 Manchester. The mechanical rhythm has become hypnotic. Your body is moving without conscious thought now, hands threading, eyes watching, feet aching, lungs burning. And you've entered a state that's neither awake nor asleep, but something in between. A survival mode where your conscious mind retreats to some protected space deep inside your skull, while your body continues the motions that keep you employed, keep you fed, keep you alive for another day. Around hour 7, something shifts in the atmosphere. A subtle change in the already oppressive environment. And you realize the smell has gotten worse, significantly worse. And you trace it to the privies, which are now overflowing, because 4 outhouses cannot handle the waste of 200 people over the course of a full working day. And the overflow is seeping back into the building through cracks in the foundation, mixing with the heat and humidity to create an olfactory nightmare that would make you vomit if you had anything left in your stomach to vomit. But you don't vomit. You just breathe through your mouth and keep working, because that's what everyone else is doing, because complaining about the smell is like complaining about gravity. It's just a fundamental condition of existence that you have to accept if you want to continue existing. The overseer walks by, and you notice he has a cloth soaked in lavender water pressed to his face. A small mercy that management affords itself but never extends to workers. And the hypocrisy is so blatant, so casual, that it doesn't even register as worthy of comment. It's just another data point in the overwhelming evidence that your life has less value than comfort, that your suffering is an acceptable cost of their profit. A fight breaks out 2 rows over, 2 workers screaming at each other and voices made raw by cotton dust. Something about one person's machine encroaching on another's workspace. And it's stupid. It's petty, but it's also completely understandable, because when you're pushed to the absolute edge of human endurance, when every nerve is frayed and every muscle is screaming and every breath hurts, the smallest provocations become unbearable. Dignity becomes something worth fighting for, even when you have so little of it left. The overseers break it up with their canes, violence meeting violence, and both workers are fined a day's wages for disrupting production. And you learn another valuable lesson. The system doesn't care who started it or why. It only cares the production was interrupted, and both parties will be punished equally regardless of justice or circumstance, because justice is expensive and punishment is cheap. Your vision is starting to blur, whether from exhaustion or cotton dust or heat stroke, you can't tell, maybe all 3. And you find yourself staring at your hands, working the machine and feeling disconnected from them, like they belong to someone else. Like you're watching yourself from outside your body. And this dissociative state is actually a mercy. A psychological defense mechanism that lets you continue functioning when every other part of your brain is screaming that this is impossible, that humans weren't designed for this, that something has to give. The little girl next to you has started crying, silent tears running down her cheeks, leaving tracks in the cotton dust that coats her face. And she's still working. Her hands never stop moving, even as her body betrays her exhaustion and fear, and you want to comfort her, but you don't know how. You don't have the energy or the words or the authority. And besides, what comfort could you possibly offer? What lie could you tell that would make this bearable? What hope could you give that wouldn't be immediately crushed by the reality of her situation? The steam engine that powers all these machines lets out a concerning groan, a deep, metallic sound that vibrates through the entire building, and for a moment, everyone freezes. Hundreds of workers all having the same thought simultaneously. Is this it? Is this the explosion we've all been waiting for? The catastrophic failure that will turn this factory into a tomb? And you realize in this moment of collective fear that nobody knows where the emergency exits are. That there probably aren't emergency exits. That if something goes wrong, you're all just trapped here to die together in a monument to unregulated capitalism. But the engine settles back into its normal rhythm, the danger passes, and everyone returns to work, because what else can you do? You can't quit over a maybe disaster when you're definitely starving. You can't let fear of death tomorrow override the certainty of starvation today. So you just accept that you're working in a building that might explode at any moment, and you focus on the immediate task of not losing your fingers to the machine in front of you. The light coming through the windows is starting to change. Afternoon becoming evening. And you realize you've been here for 12 hours, half a day, an entire morning plus afternoon spent in this hell. And you don't know how much longer the shift will last. Could be 1 more hour, could be 4. Depends entirely on whether the overseer thinks you've met quota. And quota is whatever number he decides it is. Completely arbitrary, completely unaccountable, just another way to extract maximum labor for minimum wage. The midday meal break finally arrives. Another 15 minutes of insufficient mercy. And this time, you don't even try for the privy. You just find a corner in the courtyard and eat your second piece of stale bread. This one even harder than the first because it's been in your pocket absorbing sweat and oil for 7 hours. And you chew mechanically, knowing you need the calories even if your body's too exhausted to properly register hunger anymore. You notice something you didn't see during the morning break. There's a company store across the courtyard, a small building where workers can purchase food and supplies, and you wander over out of curiosity, thinking maybe you can supplement your meager provisions with something, anything. And you look at the prices and feel your stomach drop because everything costs at least twice what it would in a normal shop in town. And you realize this is another trap, another way the factory extracts money from workers. You sell them overpriced goods and then dock their wages to pay for those goods, creating a cycle of debt that makes leaving impossible even if you wanted to. A woman next to you is arguing with the shopkeeper, insisting she's already paid for her week's bread, and the shopkeeper is insisting his books show otherwise. And you watch this dispute, knowing the shopkeeper will win because he controls the records and she can't read them, can't verify them, can't prove anything. And this is how company stores work. They're not businesses. They're systematic theft dressed up as convenience. And anyone who complains too loudly simply gets fired and blacklisted, ensuring they'll never work in any factory in Manchester again. You return to your spot in the courtyard and sit down heavily on the dirty ground. And the simple act of sitting feels so good that you could cry. The relief of taking weight off your feet is almost orgasmic. And you understand now why sitting during work hours is forbidden. Because if workers were allowed to sit, they'd remember they're human. They'd remember that their bodies have limits, and that memory would make them less productive, would make them question whether any amount of money is worth this destruction of self. The young girl from the loom next to yours is sitting nearby, and she's not eating anything, just staring at the ground with that 1,000-yard stare you're already developing. And you offer her half your bread, but she shakes her head. And you realize she's probably saving her money, probably sending everything home to family, probably hasn't eaten a proper meal in days or weeks. And this level of self-sacrifice from a 12-year-old should be inspiring. But it's really just tragic. It's just evidence of a system so broken that children voluntarily starve themselves to keep their families alive. Someone starts singing an old folk song about freedom and green fields. And for a moment, the courtyard fills with voices, workers joining in this brief rebellion of beauty against ugliness, of humanity against machinery. And it's the first time all day you've heard music instead of mechanical screaming, the first time you've experienced something that isn't designed to extract value from your body. And then the whistle blows, and the song dies mid-verse, and everyone shuffles back inside because beauty is expensive. And this factory runs on efficiency, not joy. The climb back up the stairs is harder than before. Your legs barely function. Each step is an act of will. and you grab the wall for support. But the wall is slick with condensation and provides no grip, and you slip and nearly fall, and someone behind you grabs your arm and yanks you upright, a moment of solidarity between sufferers, a wordless acknowledgement that we're all drowning together, and sometimes the only thing we can do is stop each other from going under completely. Back at your loom, the afternoon shift begins with a cruelty that feels personal, even though it's just mechanical, just systematic. The machine doesn't care that you're exhausted. It demands the same speed and precision it demanded this morning, and your hands comply even though your brain is screaming that this is impossible, that you've reached your limit, that something has to break. You look around and realize that many of the morning workers are gone, replaced by a second shift. And you feel a moment of confused hope that maybe your day is ending too. But then you see the overseer pointing at you and a dozen others, indicating you're staying. You're working a double shift, and nobody asks if you want to. Nobody checks if you can physically handle it. They just point and you stay, because refusing means firing, which means starvation, which means death. So you stay. The realization that you have another 8 hours ahead of you, that you won't see the outside of this building until possibly midnight, that you've already worked 7 hours and you're not even halfway done. This realization doesn't break you because you're already broken. It just grinds you down a little further, takes you one step closer to whatever threshold exists between human and machine, between living and merely existing. The evening shift brings a different atmosphere, darker in every sense. The windows that provided some natural light are now black mirrors reflecting the gas lamps that cast everything in sickly yellow illumination that makes everyone look jaundiced, corpse-like, already dead but still working. Ghosts operating machines in hell's anteroom. The heat hasn't decreased with sunset. If anything, it's worse because the closed windows that trap humidity also trap the day's accumulated warmth, turning the factory floor into a pressure cooker where human meat slowly breaks down under sustained temperature and stress, where your body's cooling systems simply give up because there's no cool air to exchange, no relief to be found anywhere. Your hands have stopped bleeding, not because the wounds healed, but because they're so covered in cotton fiber and oil that they've essentially been sealed by industrial waste. Nature's bandage made from the same materials that caused the injury in the first place. And you know this is going to get infected. You know that within days these small cuts will be red and swollen and painful. But that's a future problem, and you're operating entirely in the present moment. Each second its own universe of endurance. The night overseer is different from the day overseer, younger but meaner. And he carries not just a cane, but a leather strap that he snaps against his palm as he walks the rows. And you understand immediately that this is a man who enjoys his authority, who gets genuine pleasure from the power differential, who sees workers suffering not as an unfortunate necessity, but as confirmation of his own superiority, his own escape from the fate you're trapped in. He stops behind you and watches your work with cold appraisal, looking for mistakes, looking for any excuse to dock wages or administer punishment. And you feel his presence like a weight on your back, like a predator's eyes tracking prey. And your already exhausted hands start shaking slightly, which makes your work sloppier, which gives him exactly what he's looking for. And he strikes the machine frame next to your head with his strap, the crack of leather on metal right by your ear, and tells you to focus, or he'll find someone who can. And the threat is clear. Your position here is infinitely replaceable. You have no value beyond your immediate productivity. Slow down even slightly, and you're out. A man 3 machines down collapses, just drops like his strings were cut. And the overseer walks over and kicks him. Not gently, checking if he's conscious. And when the man doesn't respond immediately, he signals to 2 other workers to drag him aside. And they do. They grab their fellow worker under the arms and haul him to the wall like a sack of cotton. And they do this without emotion, because they've seen it before. Because showing empathy for the fallen is a luxury that could get you marked as weak as next. The sound of the machines seems even louder at night, or maybe you're just more aware of it now that fatigue has stripped away your psychological defenses. Every slam of the shuttle feels like it's hitting your skull directly. Every screech of the belt system feels like it's stripping away another layer of sanity. And you realize you're developing a headache that is beyond pain, that is transcended into some new category of sensation that doesn't even register as suffering anymore. It's just a new baseline, a new normal that you'll carry with you always. Someone has brought their infant to work. You can hear it crying somewhere in the factory, a tiny voice lost in the mechanical thunder. And you learn that some workers have no choice but to bring their babies because they can't afford childcare and they can't leave them home alone. And they desperately need the wages. So the babies just lie in corners, on piles of cotton, breathing in fibers and oil fumes, their lungs developing in an environment that will guarantee respiratory problems for life if they survive infancy at all. The little girl next to you has stopped crying. She's entered that dissociative state you've been drifting in and out of, where the body continues working, but the mind has retreated somewhere safer. Somewhere that doesn't include the reality of a 12-year-old working a 16-hour shift in conditions that would violate every human rights principle. That hasn't been invented yet, because human rights in 1853 are still a distant dream. A future concept that your suffering will eventually help create, but which arrives too late to save you. Your back is screaming now. The constant standing has compressed your spine, pinched nerves you didn't know you had, and every movement sends lightning bolts of pain up from your lower back into your shoulders, and you try to stretch. Just a small movement. And the overseer's strap cracks against your shoulder blade, not hard enough to injure, but hard enough to hurt, hard enough to remind you that your body is not yours during working hours. It belongs to the factory, to production, to profit. And any movement that doesn't directly contribute to textile manufacturing is theft of company time and will be punished accordingly. Around hour 13, something strange happens to time itself. It stops flowing in a linear fashion and instead becomes this thick, viscous substance that you're wading through, where minutes feel like hours and hours disappear in blinks, where you simultaneously feel like you've been here forever and also like you just started. And this temporal confusion is actually a symptom of extreme exhaustion. Your brain's time-keeping mechanisms breaking down under sustained stress. But you don't know that. You just know the reality has become slippery and unreliable. And the only constant is the machine in front of you and the pain radiating through your body. You catch yourself falling asleep, standing up. Micro sleeps where your eyes close for a second or two and your body just shuts down. And you jerk awake with a start of panic because falling asleep at the machine means your hands keep moving automatically, but without conscious control. And that's how fingers get lost. That's how people get their hair caught in the belt systems and get scalped. And you've heard the stories. Everyone has. about workers found slumped over their machines with parts of themselves feeding through the gears. And the fact that this is considered an acceptable risk rather than a humanitarian crisis tells you everything you need to know about your value in this economic system. The water situation has become desperate. There are barrels of supposedly clean water distributed around the factory floor. But after 14 hours, the water is tepid and tastes like metal and cotton and possibly cholera, because water quality in industrial Manchester is approximately the same as sewage quality anywhere else. And you're supposed to bring your own cup, but you forgot yours or never had one. So you just cup your hands and drink like an animal. And the water is so warm, it barely provides relief. It just adds liquid to your system that you'll have to hold until the next privy break, which may or may not happen because the night overseer seems to consider basic bodily functions a personal insult to his authority. A young boy, maybe 10, asks the overseer for permission to use the privy, and the overseer laughs and tells him he should have gone during the designated break. And the boy explains he wasn't working during that shift. He just started an hour ago. And the overseer's response is to remind him that rules apply to everyone, regardless of when you start. And you watch this child try to hold his bladder for what will probably be another 4 hours. And you know he'll fail. You know he'll wet himself. And you know the overseer will fine him for it and probably beat him too. And there's nothing you can do about it, because intervening means you get fired, means your family starves, means your solidarity with this child costs more than you can afford. The woman who was missing fingers earlier has returned to her machine, and you notice her hand is now bandaged, sort of. She's wrapped it in, strips torn from her skirt, and the cloth is already soaking through with blood. And she's working one-handed, using her good hand to operate the loom while the injured hand hangs at her side. And she's slower now, obviously. And the overseer is watching her with the predatory focus of someone calculating whether her reduced productivity is worth her continued employment. And you realize she's probably working through this injury not because she's tough or dedicated, but because taking time off means no wages, and no wages means her family doesn't eat tonight, tomorrow, the next day. The mechanical rhythm has become your heartbeat now. You don't even hear the machines anymore as separate from yourself. The sound has merged with your pulse, with your breathing, with the basic autonomic functions that keep you alive. And in a dark way, this is actually an adaptation, your nervous system rewiring itself to survive in an environment that should kill you, finding ways to function that evolution never intended, but that industrial capitalism demands. Your feet have gone numb, which sounds like relief, but it's actually terrifying because numbness means nerve damage, means circulation problems, means long-term consequences that you can't even begin to worry about because long-term is a luxury concept when you're not sure you'll survive the short term. Someone somewhere is singing again, softer this time, a lullaby maybe, trying to comfort that baby that's still crying in its corner of industrial poison. And the song gets cut short by the overseer's strap and a yelp of pain. But the baby keeps crying because babies don't understand that expressing distress is forbidden during working hours, that suffering is supposed to be silent, that this factory operates on the principle that human needs are obstacles to productivity rather than the entire point of economic activity. Hour 15 arrives with no announcement, no acknowledgement, just the continued grinding of machinery and flesh. And you're past exhaustion now. You've entered some transcendent state of suffering where pain has become so normalized that you barely register it. where your body has essentially given up sending distress signals because the brain has stopped responding to them. And this is both merciful and terrifying, because the absence of pain doesn't mean the absence of damage. It just means your warning systems have been overridden by necessity. The little girl next to you suddenly screams, a sound of pure agony that cuts through everything. And you turn to see her cradling her left hand. And even in the dim gaslight, you can see that her index finger is hanging at an unnatural angle, crushed by the shuttle. And the overseer is there immediately, but not to help her, to assess the damage to his machine, and when he determines the loom is fine, he tells her to either keep working or leave. Those are her options. Work maimed or starve whole. And she chooses work because of course she does, because her family needs her wages more than they need her to have all 10 functional fingers. You watch her return to the machine with her mangled hand. Watch her try to work around the injury. And the overseer provides no medical attention, no bandages. Nothing but the command to be more careful. As if being careful is possible when you're a 12-year-old who's been working for 16 hours in conditions designed to maximize productivity rather than safety. The boy who needed the privy has indeed wet himself. The dark stain spreading across his trousers, visible even in the poor light. And the overseer sees it and laughs, actually laughs, and fines him a day's wages for uncleanliness and tells him he still has 4 more hours before he can go home and change. So he'll work the rest of his shift in his own urine, which will chafe his skin raw, which will humiliate him in front of everyone, which will teach him and everyone watching that your body's needs are your own problem, not the factory's concern. Your hallucinations have started, nothing dramatic, just small visual distortions, shadows that move wrong, machines that seem to breathe, the cotton dust forming faces in the air. And you know these aren't real, but knowing doesn't make them go away. Your brain is creating patterns where there are none because pattern recognition is breaking down along with everything else. And you wonder if this is permanent, if working here long enough makes everyone a little bit mad, a little bit detached from consensus reality. The temperature has somehow gotten worse, despite it being well past midnight now. The accumulated body heat of 200 workers combined with the steam engine's output and the complete lack of ventilation has created a microclimate that feels like the surface of Venus. And people are stripping off clothes despite the rule against it. Men working, shirtless, women loosening corsets and undoing buttons because the choice is between modesty and heat stroke, and survival wins that argument every time. A bucket of water is passed around your row, and you drink deeply without questioning where it came from or what's in it. And the water is warm and tastes like rust, but it's liquid, and your body is desperate. And you'll later learn that this shared bucket system is how diseases spread through factory populations, how cholera can kill 100 workers in a week, how typhoid becomes endemic. But right now, you're just grateful for the moisture, even if it's probably killing you slowly. The factory owner himself makes an appearance. A portly man in expensive clothes, touring his kingdom at 1 in the morning because wealthy people apparently don't sleep either, though for very different reasons. And he walks through the floor with a handkerchief pressed to his nose, surveying his investment. And he stops near you and comments to the overseer that production seems low tonight, that perhaps the workers need additional motivation. And you understand that this motivation will come in the form of reduced wages or extended hours or both. That his passing observation will translate into increased suffering for everyone here. And he'll sleep soundly in his mansion, never knowing or caring that his casual comment just made life measurably worse for 200 desperate people. The machines develop a rhythm that sounds almost like language, a repetitive percussion that your exhausted brain starts interpreting as words, accusations maybe, or prophecies. And you find yourself responding to them in your head, having conversations with the looms. And this should worry you, but it doesn't, because worry requires energy you don't have. Sanity is expensive, and you're operating on a poverty budget in every possible sense. At some point past 2 a.m, the whistle finally blows. And it takes you a moment to understand what it means, because your brain has basically turned into cotton mush soaked in machine oil. But then you see people stopping their machines, see them shuffling toward the stairs, and you realize with a relief so profound, it hurts that the shift is finally ending, that you've survived your first day in a Victorian factory. And survived is really the only appropriate word, because you feel like you've been through combat, through some traumatic event that will mark you permanently. The descent down the stairs is treacherous because your legs barely work anymore. The muscles have seized up from 16 hours of standing, and you have to hold the wall for support, except there's no wall support because there are no railings and the wall is too far away. So you just take each step as its own small act of faith that your body won't completely give out, that you won't tumble down into the darkness and break your neck on the oil-slicked wood, dying just minutes before freedom. The night air hits you like a blessing. Cold Manchester air, heavy with coal smoke and industrial waste. But compared to the factory interior, it's practically alpine. And you stand in the courtyard just breathing, taking great gulps of relatively fresh air into lungs that are probably already permanently damaged by cotton dust. But right now, all you care about is that the air isn't being heated to over 100 degrees and forced through your throat like industrial sandpaper. Other workers shuffle past you like zombies, everyone moving slowly, no one speaking because speech requires energy none of you have. And you're all headed in different directions, toward different hovels and tenements and desperate sleeping arrangements. But for this moment, you're united in shared suffering, in the collective understanding that you all just survived hell together and will have to return to it in less than 6 hours. You start walking toward your lodgings. Wherever that is, you barely remember where you live, because your brain is operating on the most basic functions only. Navigation and balance taking up all available processing power, and complex thoughts like planning or reflection completely beyond your current capacity. The streets are dark and dangerous. No police patrol this area. Thieves and worse operate freely in these industrial neighborhoods. But you're too exhausted to be afraid, too depleted to care if someone robs you, because you have nothing worth stealing except your body. And that's already been stolen by the factory, already been used up and discarded for 3 shillings, minus fines, minus company store debt, minus lodging costs, which will probably leave you with about enough to buy bread for tomorrow, if you're lucky. You pass other workers from different factories, the night shift workers heading in as the day shift workers stumble out, a constant rotation of human fuel feeding the industrial machine. And you see the same hollow eyes in their faces that you see reflected in windows, the same defeated posture, the same walking death that characterizes everyone who works in these mills. Your hands are throbbing now that you're not using them. The adrenaline and necessity that kept them moving has worn off, and you're left with swollen, bleeding, infected-looking appendages that barely respond to your commands. And you'll need these hands again in 6 hours. need them to be functional enough to work another 16-hour shift. But you have no idea how that's going to happen. No idea how your body is supposed to recover in such a short time from such extreme abuse. You reach your lodging house, a decrepit building that houses about 50 workers in conditions that would make prison cells look spacious. And you climb one more set of stairs. These ones somehow worse than the factory stairs because at least there you had fear motivating you. Here you just have the final dregs of willpower pushing your legs to move one more time, to carry your destroyed body up to the 3rd floor where you rent a corner of a room shared with 5 other people. The room is dark and smells like unwashed bodies and sickness, and you find your corner, a space approximately 4 feet by 6 feet with a thin mattress on the floor that's probably infested with bed bugs and lice, but is nevertheless the most beautiful thing you've ever seen. And you collapse onto it, still wearing your filthy, oil-soaked, sweat-drenched clothes, because taking them off requires energy you simply don't have. You close your eyes and fall immediately into a sleep so deep it resembles death. Your body finally shutting down completely. And in exactly 4 hours and 30 minutes, you'll have to wake up and do this all over again. And then again the next day, and the next 6 days a week, until your body gives out completely, or you die, or somehow, miraculously, escape. You wake up to someone shaking you roughly, and for a moment you have no idea where you are or what's happening. Your brain hasn't fully rebooted from its shutdown state. And then you hear someone shouting that it's 4:30 in the morning, that the whistle blows at 5, and the reality crashes back into your consciousness like a physical blow. You have to go back to the factory. You have to do it all again. And you've only slept for what feels like minutes, but was actually 4.5 hours. And your body is screaming that this is not enough recovery time, that you need days or weeks to heal from yesterday's abuse. But time is a luxury that factory workers don't have. You try to sit up and the pain is extraordinary. Every muscle in your body is stiffened during sleep. Your back feels like it's been beaten with iron rods. Your legs refuse to straighten properly. Your hands are swollen to nearly twice their normal size, and the cuts from yesterday have indeed become infected. Red streaks radiating from the wounds in a pattern that would alarm any doctor if factory workers could afford doctors, which they can't. You stumble to your feet and realize you're still wearing yesterday's clothes, still covered in dried sweat and machine oil and cotton dust. And you have no clean clothes to change into because you only own one set. This is it. This is your wardrobe. And you'll wear these same filthy garments today and tomorrow and the next day, until they literally fall apart and you have to spend precious wages on replacements. There's no time for breakfast, no time to wash your face or hands, no time for anything except the desperate rush to make it to the factory before the 5 a.m. whistle. And you join the stream of other workers flowing through the dark streets of Manchester. All of you moving like the walking dead. Zombies stumbling toward your mechanical masters. The pre-dawn darkness is oppressive. No street lights in this part of town. And you navigate more by sound and the presence of other bodies than by sight. And you think about how your entire life has become this endless cycle of darkness. You leave for work in darkness and return home in darkness. You never see sunlight except through filthy factory windows. Never feel it on your skin. And this deprivation of natural light is doing things to your body and mind that you don't fully understand, but can feel nonetheless. A kind of spiritual decay that runs parallel to the physical destruction. You arrive at the factory with 5 minutes to spare, join the crowd pressing through the gates, and climb those terrible stairs again with legs that barely function. And you wonder how long human bodies can sustain this, how many days or weeks or months before something catastrophic happens. Before your heart gives out, or your brain shuts down, or you simply collapse and never get up. The overseer is already there, of course, fresh and alert because he probably slept 8 hours in a proper bed, in a proper home. And he watches the workers file in with that same predatory assessment, looking for signs of weakness, identifying who might be worth keeping and who might need to be replaced. And you understand that, to him, you're not human. You're livestock. Work animals to be evaluated solely on productivity and endurance. And when you're no longer productive enough, you'll be sent to slaughter, metaphorically speaking. Though the workhouse where broken factory workers end up might as well be an actual slaughterhouse for all the mercy shown there. The machines start up with that same violent screaming, and you take your position at your loom, and your hands move into the motions automatically, even though every movement sends lightning bolts of pain through the infected cuts and swollen joints. And you realize that your body has learned these movements so thoroughly in just one day that it can perform them even while damaged. Even while your conscious mind is screaming that this is impossible, that you can't do this, that something has to change. But nothing changes. Nothing ever changes in factories like this. The only variable is how long individual workers last before they're used up and discarded. And you're beginning to understand that your timeline is probably measured in months rather than years. That the average factory worker's career is brutally short. That most people who start this work at your age are dead or disabled by 30. And you're looking at maybe a decade of this hell if you're extraordinarily lucky and careful. And that's assuming you don't have an accident that kills or maims you in the meantime. The little girl next to you is back, her crushed finger now a swollen purple disaster that she's trying to keep out of the machine's way while still working at the required pace. And you see her wince with every movement, see tears running down her face that she's not even bothering to wipe away because her hands are too busy, and tears are just another bodily function that has to be ignored during working hours. Day 2 is somehow worse than day 1 because your body hasn't recovered from day 1. You're starting from a deficit, operating damaged machinery that's being expected to perform at the same level as undamaged machinery. And the factory doesn't care about your deficit, doesn't adjust expectations or reduce quotas. It just demands the same output regardless of your condition. The infected cuts on your hands are now openly weeping, pus and blood mixing with cotton fibers to create a grotesque paste that you can't clean because there's nowhere to clean it and no time to clean it, even if there were. And you're probably going to lose at least one finger to infection before the week is out. That's just the mathematical reality of untreated wounds in unsanitary conditions. But you can't think about that now. Can't think about anything except the immediate task of keeping thread running through the loom. A new worker arrives mid-morning, a woman who looks to be in her 30s but is probably younger, aged prematurely by poverty and hard living, and the overseer assigns her to a loom 3 down from yours. And within an hour, she's made a mistake, threaded something wrong, and the overseer is on her immediately, screaming inches from her face. And when she tries to explain that she's never worked a loom before, that she needs more training, he strikes her across the face with his cane, splitting her lip open, and tells her that training is what she's doing right now. Learning through consequences, and if she can't learn fast enough, she's welcome to leave and starve. You watch this and understand that you got lucky yesterday. The overseer who trained you was merely indifferent rather than actively sadistic, merely abandoned you to figure it out rather than beating you for not already knowing. And this small mercy is the only advantage you have over this poor woman who is now working with blood running down her chin, adding her DNA to the factory's collection of human fluids that coat every surface. The heat builds earlier today. Or maybe you're just more aware of it because your body's already depleted, already operating without reserves. And by hour 3, you're feeling dizzy, your vision swimming, and you recognize these as signs of dehydration or heat exhaustion. But recognizing them doesn't give you any options for addressing them. You just have to push through and hope you don't collapse, because collapsing means no wages, and no wages means your family doesn't eat. A boy of maybe 8 is working as a scavenger, crawling under the machines to collect fallen cotton. And you watch in horror as his shirt gets caught in a belt drive. Watch as he's yanked upward, and for a terrible moment, you think you're about to witness a child being pulled into machinery and killed. But the shirt tears, and he drops back to the floor, landing hard enough that you hear the impact over the machine noise. And he just lies there for a moment, stunned or injured, you can't tell. And then he gets up and continues collecting cotton, because stopping would mean getting beaten by the overseer, would mean losing his position, would mean his family loses the pittance he brings home. The woman with the split lip has started coughing, deep, racking coughs that sound wet and painful. And you recognize that sound. Everyone who works here recognizes that sound. It's the sound of lungs filling with cotton dust, the sound of brown lung disease developing in real time. And she's only been here a few hours, but the damage is already starting because the concentration of fibers in the air is so high that respiratory damage is essentially immediate. And working here for any length of time guarantees permanent lung damage. It's not a risk. It's a certainty, just a question of how severe and how fast. Your feet have developed blisters from standing. You can feel them rupturing inside your shoes with each step. Feel the fluid mixing with the sweat and grime. And you know these blisters will become infected like everything else becomes infected in this environment. And walking will become agony. And you'll still have to walk, still have to stand, because alternative is unemployment, and unemployment is death. The first break finally arrives. 15 minutes that feels like both too much and not enough. Too much time to fully register how much pain you're in, not enough time to do anything about it. And you shuffle down to the courtyard and sit heavily. And the simple act of sitting is so pleasurable that you almost cry. And you eat your stale bread mechanically, fuel going into a machine. No enjoyment, no taste, just calories being consumed because your body needs them to continue functioning for another 12 hours. During the break, you overhear conversations between veteran workers, people who've been here for months or even years, though years seems impossible given the conditions. And they're discussing a worker who died last week, just collapsed at his machine and never woke up. Heart gave out at 26 years old. And they're discussing this in the same tone you might use to discuss weather, casual and matter of fact. Because death is so common here that it barely registers as noteworthy. And you realize that you're living in a war zone where casualties are expected and mourning is a luxury nobody can afford. One of the older workers, a man who might be 40 but looks 60, starts talking about the old days before the factories, when textile work was done at home, and sure, it was hard work. But you could sit down, you could take breaks when you needed them. You could work at your own pace, and the factories promised progress and higher wages. But what they delivered was industrialized suffering, was the transformation of craft into repetition, of humans into components. And you understand that you're witnessing the birth of a new kind of hell, one that will define the next century, one that your suffering is helping to normalize and legitimize. The whistle blows and break time ends, and you climb those stairs again. And each time you climb them, it gets harder. Your legs have less power, your lungs have less capacity. And you wonder if there will come a day when you physically cannot climb these stairs, when your body simply refuses to carry you up one more time. And what happens then? Do they fire you on the spot? Do they drag you up anyway? Do you just die on the stairs and get thrown aside like garbage? Back at your loom, the afternoon shift begins with a new horror. The overseer announces that quota has been raised, that management has determined that workers can be more productive, and therefore everyone must increase their output by 10% starting immediately. And there will be no increase in wages to correspond with this increase in productivity. Just the threat that anyone who can't meet the new quota will be replaced by someone who can. You look around and see the despair on everyone's faces. The understanding that 10% more production means 10% more injury risk, 10% more exhaustion, 10% closer to the breaking point. And there's no negotiation, no discussion, just the unilateral decision by people who never work a loom that people who work looms should work them harder. Your hands speed up automatically, muscle memory responding to the threat even as your brain screams that this is unsustainable. And you feel something tear in your right shoulder. A sharp pain, followed by a burning sensation that suggests you've damaged a tendon or muscle. But you keep working because stopping to assess the injury would result in failing to meet quota. And failing to meet quota would result in termination. So you work through the injury and feel it get progressively worse with each movement. Feel whatever you tore stretching further. And you understand that this injury will be permanent, that your right shoulder will never be the same, that you've just sacrificed a piece of your body's structural integrity on the altar of productivity. The little girl next to you is crying again, not just tears, but full sobbing. And you risk a glance over and see that her infected finger has swollen to grotesque proportions, the skin tight and shiny, and she's trying to work around it. But it's clearly affecting her dexterity, affecting her ability to meet the new quota. And the overseer is watching her with that calculating look. And you know he's deciding whether she's worth keeping or whether her injury has made her more expensive than she's worth. A commotion erupts several rows over, someone screaming, and you turn to see a man clutching his arm, blood pouring between his fingers. And apparently, he got his hand caught in the shuttle mechanism and lost 3 fingers in an instant. And the overseer is there immediately, but not to help, to determine if the loom is damaged, and when he confirms the machine is fine, he wraps the man's mangled hand in a dirty rag and tells him to go to the company doctor. And you'll learn later that the company doctor is actually just a man with no medical training who was hired because he's cheap and won't report injuries to authorities. Who'll treat this amputation with alcohol and a bandage and charge the worker for the service, deducting it from wages that the worker will no longer be able to earn because you can't operate a loom with only 2 fingers on your dominant hand. The afternoon heat reaches new levels of unbearable, and you notice that some workers have started to look waxy and pale. their skin taking on a sickly sheen that you recognize as heat exhaustion progressing toward heat stroke. And you watch as a woman 2 rows ahead simply faints, dropping to the floor like a puppet with cut strings. And the overseer walks over and kicks her in the ribs, checking if she's responsive. And when she groans, he orders 2 other workers to carry her to a corner and pour water on her. And if she wakes up, she can return to work. And if she doesn't wake up, they'll carry her out and hire someone else. That's the protocol. That's the extent of the factory's concern for worker well-being. You're dizzy yourself, your vision tunneling, and you recognize that you're also approaching heat stroke, that your body's cooling systems have failed, that you're cooking from the inside out. But you can't stop, can't slow down, can't do anything except keep working and hope that you don't pass out before the next break, because passing out means falling, and falling means potential injury. And injury means lost wages, and lost wages means your family starves. The water barrels are empty by mid-afternoon. Nobody thought to refill them, or maybe the factory deliberately limits water to save money. And workers are suffering from severe dehydration, mouths dry, lips cracking. And some people are so desperate. They're drinking the water that collects in corners, stagnant pools that probably contain every disease known to Victorian England. But when you're dying of thirst, cholera tomorrow seems preferable to dehydration today. You notice that your urine, when you finally get a privy break, is dark brown, almost orange, a clear sign of dangerous dehydration. And you know you need water desperately, but there is no water. There is only the requirement to keep working, to keep producing, to keep generating profit for people who sleep in cool rooms and drink clean water and never consider the cost of their comfort. The little girl next to you has stopped crying, which initially seems like a good thing until you look over and realize she's stopped crying because she's in shock. Her infected finger has progressed to blood poisoning. You can see the red streaks running up her arm. And she's pale and sweating and glassy-eyed. And she needs a doctor immediately. Needs antibiotics that won't be invented for another 90 years. Needs medical intervention that she will never receive because her family cannot afford treatment and the factory considers her disposable. The man who lost his fingers returns from the company doctor, his hand wrapped in a filthy bandage that's already soaking through with blood. And he's back at his loom trying to work one-handed. And the overseer watches him for about 30 minutes before declaring him unfit for work and firing him on the spot. No severance, no compensation for his injury, no acknowledgement that he lost his fingers in service of the factory's profits. Just a dismissal and the instruction to clear out immediately. You watch him leave, this man who came to work whole this morning and is leaving permanently disabled, unable to perform most jobs, facing a future of begging or the workhouse. And nobody says anything. Nobody protests, because everyone understands that protesting means joining him in unemployment. And solidarity is expensive when you're already starving. The machines continue their screaming rhythm. And you've been working for 11 hours now, with only 30 minutes of breaks total. And your body has entered a state beyond exhaustion, beyond pain, a kind of mechanical operation, where you're no longer consciously controlling your movements, where your body has become an automaton. And this dissociation is the only thing keeping you functional. Because if you were fully present, fully aware of what you're doing to yourself, you would stop, and stopping is not an option. A child starts screaming somewhere in the factory, a sound of absolute terror. And you learn later that she got her hair caught in a belt drive and was partially scalped before someone could stop the machine. And the factory's response is to fire her mother for bringing a child who was careless enough to get injured, because obviously the problem is the child's carelessness and not the exposed machinery or the lack of safety equipment or the desperation that forces families to bring children into industrial death traps. The sun is setting outside. You can tell by the changing quality of light through the filthy windows, and you realize you've almost survived day 2, almost made it through another 16 hours of hell. And the fact that you're thinking in terms of survival rather than work, that you're measuring success by not dying rather than by productivity or learning or any positive metric. This tells you everything you need to know about what your life has become in just 48 hours. The final hours of day 2 drag on with a particular cruelty. Time becoming elastic and torturous, each minute feeling like an hour. And you catch yourself checking the windows obsessively for signs of true darkness, for indication that your shift might be ending soon. But the overseer has given no signal, no hint that relief is coming, and you begin to fear that tonight will be another double shift, another forced extension, another few hours stolen from your non-existent recovery time. Your infected hands have progressed to the point where you can barely close them. The swelling is so severe that gripping anything is agony. And yet you grip the shuttle. You thread the loom. You perform the motions because the alternative is termination, and termination in your current physical state, unable to work anywhere else, would be a death sentence slower, but just as certain as walking into the Thames. The little girl next to you is gone. You didn't see when they took her, didn't hear anything over the machine noise. But her loom sits empty now, and you know she's either being carried to the workhouse infirmary, where she'll probably die of sepsis, or she's already dead and being carried to a pauper's grave. And either way, she's 12 years old, and her life is essentially over. Destroyed by 2 days of work in a cotton mill. And this should shock you, but you're beyond shock. You're beyond feeling much of anything except the physical sensations of your own destruction. A new child takes her place within the hour. A boy who looks even younger, maybe 9 or 10, and he's terrified. You can see it in his eyes, but he's also desperate, and desperation overrides terror. And he starts working his loom with shaking hands. And you want to warn him, want to tell him to be careful with the shuttle, to watch for the belt drives, to protect his fingers and his hair and his life. But you don't have the energy to speak, don't have the breath to waste on warnings that he won't be able to follow anyway. Because being careful is incompatible with meeting quota. A group of well-dressed people tours through the factory in the evening. Philanthropists or journalists, or maybe just wealthy people looking for entertainment in viewing poverty. And they walk through with handkerchiefs pressed to their faces, asking the overseer questions about productivity and profits. And they look at you, look at all the workers, but they don't see people. They see statistics. They see talking points for whatever article or report they're writing. And they'll go home to their comfortable houses, and maybe they'll write something sympathetic. Maybe they'll suggest reform. But nothing will change because the people with the power to change things are the same people profiting from things staying exactly as they are. Your right shoulder is now completely useless. The pain has progressed from sharp to dull to a kind of nauseating throb that radiates down your entire arm. And you're working mostly one-handed, compensating with your left hand. And this means you're slower, which means you're not meeting the new quota, which means you're at risk of being fired. And the fear of unemployment is the only thing keeping you upright, keeping you moving, because you've invested so much suffering into this job that losing it now would mean all that suffering was for nothing. The whistle finally blows at some point well past 8 p.m., 14 hours after you started, and you've worked 2 14-hour days back to back with only 4.5 hours of sleep between them. And you've accumulated injuries that will never fully heal, infections that are probably going to kill you if you can't afford treatment. And you've earned maybe 6 shillings for these 2 days, which after fines and company store deductions will probably be closer to 4 shillings. And 4 shillings is not enough to live on. It's not enough to feed yourself adequately. Definitely not enough to afford medical care or clean housing or any of the things that might help you survive this job long enough to earn more money. The walk home is worse tonight than last night. Your body has less to give, less reserve to draw on, and you're moving through the streets like a ghost, barely aware of your surroundings, operating on the most basic survival instincts. And you see other workers around you in similar states, everyone shuffling through the darkness like the walking dead. And you understand that this is the true face of the Industrial Revolution, not the steam engines and cotton mills and economic growth that they teach about in schools, but this exhausted parade of destroyed humans. This is what progress actually looks like from the bottom. You reach your lodging house and discover a new horror. Your corner has been rented to someone else. The landlord explaining that you were late with this week's rent by a few hours, and he assumed you'd been fired or died. So he gave your space to another worker who could pay immediately. And now you have nowhere to sleep, no place to recover from the day's destruction. And the landlord is unmoved by your protests, by your explanation that you were literally working and couldn't pay until you received wages. Because to him, you're just another source of income. And if you can't pay promptly, there are 50 other desperate workers who will. You end up in the street, finding a doorway that provides some shelter from the wind. And you sit down on cold stone and realize that you're homeless now, that your financial margin was so razor thin that being a few hours late with rent has resulted in losing your housing entirely. And you have no savings to rent another place, no family to take you in, nothing but the clothes on your back and the damage accumulating in your body. The night is cold. Manchester in 1853 doesn't have pollution controls or clean air acts. And the air is thick with coal smoke that makes your already damaged lungs burn with each breath. And you try to sleep sitting up because lying down on the filthy street seems too dangerous, too vulnerable. But your body is so exhausted that you keep nodding off despite the cold and the fear and the complete lack of comfort. Other homeless workers huddle in nearby doorways, and you realize that this is common, that factory workers losing housing is so routine that there's essentially a homeless community that exists in the shadows of the factories. People who work full-time but can't afford shelter, who are trapped in a cycle where they need the job to have money for housing, but can't afford housing on the wages the job pays. Someone tries to rob you in the middle of the night, a hand reaching for your pockets, and you wake up swinging, fighting off your attacker with strength you didn't know you still had. And it turns out to be another worker, just as desperate as you. And you both end up staring at each other in the darkness. Two victims of the same system fighting over nothing because neither of you has anything worth stealing. And the absurdity of it would be funny if it weren't so tragic. You don't sleep much, maybe an hour total in fragments. And when 4 a.m. arrives and it's time to head back to the factory, you can barely stand. Your body has reached a level of exhaustion that feels incompatible with consciousness, let alone manual labor. But you stand anyway because the alternative is starving. And you join the stream of workers heading toward another day of destruction. Day 3 starts identically to day 2. The same stairs, the same machines, the same overseer with his cane and his cold appraisal. But everything feels worse because you're operating at an even greater deficit. Your body now carrying 2 days of accumulated damage, plus a night spent sleeping on stone in the cold. And you can feel yourself breaking down in real time. Can feel systems failing, muscles tearing, infections spreading. The overseer notices your deteriorating condition and pulls you aside. And for a moment you think he might show mercy, might give you a lighter assignment or a break. But instead he tells you that your productivity has dropped, that you're not meeting quota, and that if you can't improve immediately, you'll be terminated, and the threat is clear. Work through your injuries or lose your job. There are no accommodations, no understanding, no recognition that the injuries preventing you from meeting quota were acquired in service of previous quotas. You return to your loom and try to speed up, try to compensate for your useless shoulder and infected hands and complete exhaustion. And something in your lower back snaps. Not metaphorically. You literally feel something break or tear. And suddenly you can't stand fully upright. You're bent forward at an angle that makes working even harder. But you keep working because what else can you do? You're 3 days into this job and you've already accumulated injuries that will probably disable you permanently. And stopping now means all that damage was for nothing. Means you destroyed your body without even earning enough to survive. The new boy next to you is learning quickly, his hands already moving with more confidence. And you realize that he's going to survive longer than you will. That his younger body can handle the abuse better. That the factory preferring children isn't just about their size or their wages. It's about their resilience, their ability to absorb damage that would break adult bodies. And this makes you both glad for him and terrified for yourself because you understand that you're already obsolete, already broken beyond useful. And you've been here 3 days. Around mid-morning on day 3, your body stages a mutiny. Your hands simply stop responding properly. The infected cuts and swollen joints have progressed to the point where fine motor control is impossible. And you're dropping things, fumbling with a thread, making mistakes that would get you fired if the overseer notices. And he does notice. He always notices. And he's heading your way with his cane raised, and you know what's coming, but you're too exhausted to care anymore. Too broken to fear pain that's just addition to the agony you're already experiencing. He strikes you across the shoulders, shouting about incompetence and laziness. And the physical pain is somehow less than the humiliation, less than the shame of being beaten in front of dozens of witnesses who can't help you because helping you would mean joining you in punishment. And you try to work faster, try to compensate, but your hands won't cooperate. They've reached their limit, and you're watching them fail in real time, watching your last economic resource disappear. A woman 3 rows over starts screaming, not from injury, but from something worse. A complete psychological breakdown. She's screaming that she can't do this anymore. That she'd rather die than spend 1 more minute in this hell. And several workers grab her and try to calm her down. But she's beyond calming. She's reached the point where survival instinct is overridden by the desperate need to escape at any cost. and the overseer has her dragged out. Not gently. And you'll learn later that she threw herself into the River Irwell that same day. That factory-induced suicide is common enough that the newspapers don't even report it anymore. That drowning yourself is considered a reasonable response to industrial employment. Your vision is getting strange again. The cotton dust, combined with exhaustion and possibly infection, causing hallucinations or just perceptual distortions. And you see the machines as living things, as monsters that consume humans, and this isn't actually that far from reality. The machines do consume humans, slowly but systematically. And you're being consumed right now, being processed into profit. And when you're used up, the machine will spit out your empty husk and consume the next person. The lunch break arrives, and you can barely make it down the stairs, your back injury making each step agony. And you sit in the courtyard and try to eat your bread, but your swollen hands can't grip it properly, can't tear it into pieces, and you end up just pressing it against your mouth and gnawing at it like an animal, dignity abandoned in favor of basic nutrition. Another worker offers to help you, tries to tear your bread for you. And this small act of kindness makes you want to cry because kindness is so rare here, so unexpected. And you realize that you've become so accustomed to cruelty that basic human decency feels overwhelming. And this realization is maybe the saddest thing yet. That 3 days of factory work has recalibrated your expectations of humanity downward to the point where someone helping you eat registers as extraordinary compassion. You see the boy who lost his shirt to the belt drive yesterday. He's back at work wearing what looks like a potato sack with armholes cut in it, and he's covered in bruises from his fall. And you want to tell him to stay home and recover. But you know he can't. No, his family needs his wages too desperately. And anyway, where would he recover? His housing situation is probably as precarious as yours was. And there's no such thing as sick leave when your employer views you as disposable machinery. The afternoon shift begins with yet another quota increase. The overseer announcing that management has analyzed productivity and determined that workers can handle another 5% increase in output. And you listen to this announcement with the detached fascination of someone watching their own execution. Because you cannot physically produce 5% more. You can barely produce at your current diminished rate. And this quota increase is effectively your termination notice. They're just making you work until you literally can't anymore. And then they'll fire you for failing to meet impossible standards. Your hands are shaking uncontrollably now, tremors that make precise work almost impossible. And you don't know if it's from exhaustion or infection or nerve damage, probably all 3, and you're making mistakes constantly, dropping thread, jamming the shuttle, and each mistake is noted by the overseer, tallied against you, building a case for your dismissal that will come soon, maybe today, maybe tomorrow. But definitely soon, because your body has already given everything it had to give and is now operating on borrowed time, on biological processes that should have shut down hours ago, but are somehow still functioning out of pure, desperate necessity. The inevitable happens around hour 8 of day 3. The overseer pulls you off your loom and tells you that you're being let go, that your productivity has become unacceptable, and they're replacing you with someone more capable. And the word capable is particularly cruel because your incapability is entirely the result of injuries sustained while being capable, while meeting their demands, while destroying your body in their service. He hands you a slip of paper with your wages calculated, and when you look at the numbers, you feel sick. 3 days of work, 40+ hours of suffering. And after all the fines for mistakes, deductions for damaged materials, charges for drinking water and using the privy, and a dozen other petty extractions, you're owed 1 shilling and 4 pence. Barely enough to buy food for 3 days, certainly not enough to secure housing or medical treatment or anything that might help you recover from the damage you've sustained. You try to argue, try to explain that the injuries preventing you from working were caused by the work itself. But the overseer doesn't care, doesn't even pretend to listen. He just tells you to leave immediately, or he'll have you thrown out. And you understand that there is no justice here, no arbitration, no recognition of employer responsibility, just the raw power of capital over labor. Take it or leave it, and if you leave it, you starve. You walk out of the factory at 10 in the morning, still technically morning, though it feels like you've lived an entire lifetime since 5 a.m. And the daylight is disorienting. You've become so accustomed to working in gaslight and darkness that natural sunlight feels wrong, alien, and you stand in the courtyard, blinking like some creature that's been underground too long. Other fired workers are there too. People who were deemed insufficiently productive. And you're all standing around with your slips of paper showing pittance wages. And someone suggests going to the factory owner's house to demand better payment. And everyone agrees this is a good idea, even though everyone also knows it won't work. But doing something feels better than accepting defeat. Feels like maintaining some shred of dignity, even though dignity has been systematically stripped from all of you. You walk together through Manchester streets, a small group of broken workers, and people avoid you. Cross the street to avoid passing too close, because your appearance marks you as factory workers, as the lowest class, as people whose touch might be contaminating. And you understand that industrial workers occupy a social position below even traditional poor people. You're a new class of poverty. Industrial poverty, poverty that comes with maiming and exhaustion and early death. The factory owner's house is in a better part of town, a 3-story building with actual gardens, with clean windows and painted shutters. And the contrast between this house and the lodgings you've seen is so stark it's almost incomprehensible that both exist in the same city, in the same economic system, that one man's comfort is built so directly on another man's suffering. You knock on the door and a servant answers, looks at your group with undisguised disgust. And when you explain that you want to speak to the owner about wages, the servant laughs and closes the door in your faces, not even bothering to relay your message. Because the idea that factory workers might have legitimate grievances worth the owner's attention is apparently hilarious. You stand there on the street feeling stupid and helpless. And someone suggests going to a magistrate, filing a formal complaint. And you all walk to the courthouse. And the clerk there listens to your story with barely concealed boredom, and then explains that workers have no legal recourse against employers for wages or working conditions, that the courts don't handle labor disputes, that your only option is to accept the wages offered or find employment elsewhere. And this is the law. This is justice in 1853 Britain. Capital has rights and labor has obligations, and never the two shall meet. You leave the courthouse with your hope crushed, your last belief in fairness or justice completely destroyed. And you understand now that the system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed. It's meant to extract maximum value from human bodies with minimum compensation. Meant to use people up and discard them. Meant to concentrate wealth upward while pushing poverty downward. And you've just learned this lesson the hardest possible way. Through your own flesh, your own suffering, your own permanent disability acquired in service of someone else's profit margin. You spend the afternoon wandering Manchester's industrial district with 1 shilling and 4pence in your pocket. Infected hands that can barely function, a damaged shoulder, a broken back, lungs filled with cotton dust, and no housing, no prospects, no future beyond the immediate question of how to survive the next 24 hours. You try several other factories, thinking maybe you can find work somewhere else, somewhere that won't notice your injuries or won't care. But factory work requires 2 functional hands, and you don't have those anymore. And the hiring managers take one look at your swollen, infected digits and turn you away. Some with sympathy, most with indifference. Because Manchester in 1853 has an infinite supply of desperate workers and no shortage of bodies willing to trade their health for pennies. You consider the workhouse the last resort for people who have absolutely nothing left. But you've heard the stories, everyone's heard the stories, about how workhouses are essentially prisons where the poor are punished for being poor, where families are separated, where conditions are deliberately kept worse than the worst jobs to discourage people from seeking help, where death rates are higher than in the factories because at least factories want to extract labor from you before you die, whereas workhouses are just waiting rooms for death. You buy some bread with part of your wages, and while you're eating it in an alley, you're approached by a man who offers you work, and your first thought is relief. Maybe there's hope after all. But then he explains what the work is. He runs a gang that robs drunk sailors in the port district, and he needs people who are desperate enough to take risks and broken enough that they won't be tempted to run to the police. And you realize he's recruiting you because you look like someone with nothing to lose, which is accurate, but also deeply depressing. You decline his offer not out of moral superiority, but out of practicality. Your hands can't grip things well enough to hold weapons or climb or do any of the things criminal work requires. You're too injured even for crime, too broken to break the law effectively. And this realization that you've fallen below the minimum physical standards for both legal and illegal employment is somehow the most crushing thing yet. You find yourself near the river Irwell as evening approaches, and you understand why that woman from the factory came here. Why suicide by drowning is common among industrial workers. Because the river offers something the factory never did. An end to suffering, a final escape from a system that seems designed to extract every possible moment of agony from human bodies before discarding them. You don't jump. Not because you don't want to, but because some stubborn part of your brain refuses to let industrial capitalism claim your life after it's already claimed your health, refuses to let the factory win completely. And this defiance is probably stupid, probably just prolonging inevitable suffering. But it's all you have left. This small refusal to accept the narrative that workers are disposable. You spend your second night on the streets, finding another doorway. And the cold is worse tonight. Or maybe you're just weaker, more vulnerable. Your body's reserves completely depleted, and you drift in and out of consciousness, never fully sleeping, always aware of the cold and the pain and the sounds of the city around you. The sounds of other people living their lives while yours has effectively ended at whatever age you are. 20-something probably. And you've been permanently disabled, financially ruined, and socially discarded in the space of 3 days. Morning arrives, and you're still alive, which is either good news or bad news depending on your perspective. And you have to decide what to do with another day of existence. another 24 hours of pain and hunger and homelessness, and your options are limited. You can try to find any work at all, even if it pays almost nothing. Or you can try to beg. Or you can try to walk out of Manchester entirely, try to find some rural area where maybe life is slightly less brutal, though that's probably naive, probably just romanticizing countryside poverty, which is different from urban poverty, but not necessarily better. You check your infected hands, and the red streaks have spread further up your arms. The infection is winning. Sepsis is probably setting in. And without medical treatment, you'll be dead within a week, maybe less. And medical treatment costs money you don't have and won't have. And this is how many factory workers die. Not from dramatic accidents, but from slow infections, from injuries that in any other context would be treatable. But in the context of industrial poverty are death sentences. Because the same system that causes the injuries also ensures you can't afford to treat them. You decide to try begging, which is illegal in Manchester, but so is starving to death, and one of those seems more immediately threatening than the other. And you position yourself near a church thinking maybe religious people will be more sympathetic, more likely to see your suffering as something worthy of compassion, rather than something you deserve for being weak or lazy or morally deficient. The first few hours produce nothing. People walk past you without even looking. You're invisible to them. Just part of the urban furniture, another piece of human wreckage that the Industrial Revolution has produced and discarded. And you understand that begging is actually quite difficult. It requires a kind of performance, a presentation of suffering that generates pity rather than disgust. And you're too exhausted to perform, too broken to make your suffering appealing. A policeman eventually moves you along, not arresting you, but making it clear that you can't stay there, that your presence is disturbing the respectable people. And you wonder what makes them respectable and you not. You worked until your body broke. You tried to participate in the economy. You did everything society demanded of you. And the reward is this: being moved along by police for having the audacity to be visibly poor. You end up near the workhouse by mid-afternoon, not because you've decided to enter, but because you've been wandering aimlessly and this is where your feet have taken you. And you stand outside looking at the building, a massive brick structure that looks more like a prison than a place of charity. And you watch people entering, families with children, old people who can no longer work. And they all have this same defeated look, this understanding that entering the workhouse is admitting complete failure, accepting that you are now dependent on public charity, which comes with punishment built in, with separation from family, with labor that's deliberately harder than regular work to discourage malingering. You turn away from the workhouse and keep walking, not because you have somewhere to go, but because stopping feels like dying. Like if you sit down, you'll never get up again. And movement at least creates the illusion of purpose, of going somewhere, even though you're really just drifting, waiting for your body to completely fail, or for some opportunity to present itself, whichever comes first. You pass a factory that's hiring, signs posted everywhere advertising positions available, and you almost laugh because you know what those positions entail. You know exactly what they're offering. 3 days of experience has taught you more about industrial employment than any economist or philosopher could explain. And the fact that they're always hiring isn't evidence of economic growth. It's evidence of constant turnover, of workers being used up and replaced in an endless cycle of exploitation. Your fever is getting worse. You can feel it. A heat that has nothing to do with exertion and everything, to do with infection spreading through your bloodstream. And you're probably hallucinating a bit. The edges of your vision going soft and strange. And you think about those workers back at the factory, the ones still there, still working, still destroying themselves for pennies. And you wonder if they think about you, if they registered your firing at all, or if you've already been forgotten, replaced not just in your position, but in their memory. Just another casualty in a war that never makes the newspapers. You find a public fountain and drink deeply, and the water is probably contaminated, probably full of cholera or typhoid or a dozen other diseases. But you're dying anyway, so what does it matter? Might as well be hydrated while you die. Might as well experience one small comfort before the end. A woman gives you a penny, just walks up and hands it to you without saying anything. And this small act of kindness breaks something in you. Tears start flowing and you can't stop them, crying not just from the kindness, but from everything, from the exhaustion and pain and injustice, from the understanding that your life has been destroyed for no good reason, that you're dying at 20-something because the economic system that everyone insists is progress and civilization and the natural order actually requires human sacrifice, actually demands that some people be ground up to fuel other people's prosperity. You buy a meat pie with the penny, probably your last meal, and it tastes better than anything you've ever eaten. Not because it's particularly good, but because you're starving and dying, and this might be the last thing you ever taste, and you savor every bite, letting the warmth spread through your body, knowing that soon you'll be cold permanently, that the infections or the exposure or the starvation will finally win. And some part of you is okay with that. Some part of you is actually relieved that the suffering has an end point, that eventually this all stops, that death is the working class's only guaranteed benefit. You wake up the next morning in an alley, not sure when you fell asleep or how you got there. Your memory has become fragmented, pieces missing, time losing coherence as your fever climbs higher and your body shuts down non-essential functions to focus on fighting the infection that's already won. Your hands are now almost unrecognizable as hands, swollen to the point where individual fingers are barely distinguishable. The skin tight and shiny and hot to the touch. And the smell is unmistakable. The sweet rot of gangrene, of tissue dying while still attached to your body. And you understand that even if you somehow survive the infection, you'd lose both hands to amputation, would be left completely unable to work, completely dependent on charity or crime, neither of which you're capable of performing. You try to stand, and your legs won't cooperate. The muscles have simply given up, depleted beyond recovery. And you realize that you're dying here, in this alley, in the filth, and nobody will find you for days probably. And when they do find you, they'll just haul your body to a pauper's grave, and that will be the end of your story. No marker, no mourning, no record that you existed, except maybe a line in some factory's ledger showing wages paid and position filled. The sounds of the city continue around you. Manchester going about its business, factories running, people working, the great machine of industrial capitalism grinding forward. And your death is so insignificant in that context, so utterly meaningless to the system that killed you. You're just one unit of labor that broke and needs replacing. And there are thousands more where you came from. An endless supply of desperate bodies willing to trade everything for nothing. You think about your family, whoever they are, wherever they are, You can't quite remember the details anymore. Your fever has burned away specifics, leaving only vague impressions of people who loved you once. Before you came to Manchester, before you became a factory worker, before you became a statistic, and you wonder if they'll ever know what happened to you. If anyone will bother to inform them that you died alone in an alley at 20-something years old, or if you'll just disappear. One more person who went to the city seeking opportunity and simply vanished into the industrial maw. A dog sniffs at you, probably checking if you're dead yet, if you're ready to be scavenged. And you don't have the energy to shoo it away. You just lie there and let it investigate. And the dog loses interest and moves on, deciding you're not quite dead enough yet. And you think about how you've fallen so far that even dogs find you unappetizing. And this thought strikes you as darkly funny, hysterical even. And you start laughing, which turns into coughing, which turns into agony, as your damaged lungs and broken ribs protest the movement. The pain is everywhere now, not localized to specific injuries, but diffuse, systemic. Your entire body is one continuous ache that has transcended pain and become something else. Some new state of being where suffering is so normalized that you can't remember what it felt like to not hurt. Can't conceive of an existence that isn't defined entirely by physical agony. You hear footsteps, someone entering the alley, and you try to call out, but your voice won't work properly. Comes out as a croak. And the footsteps pause. Someone looking down at you. And you see a man's face. Another worker by his clothes. And he looks at you with something that might be pity or might be recognition. The understanding that this could be him. Probably will be him eventually. Because this is where the road ends for factory workers. This is the destination you're all traveling toward, whether you know it or not. The man doesn't help you. Can't help you, really. What would helping even look like? He doesn't have money for doctors. Doesn't have resources beyond his own desperate survival. And helping you would require sacrificing his own precarious stability. And nobody can afford that kind of charity when they're one bad day away from being in your position. So he just looks at you for a moment with sad eyes and then continues walking, leaving you alone again. And you understand this isn't cruelty. It's just pragmatism. It's what the system demands. Every person for themselves, solidarity is expensive, and poverty breeds isolation. The sun is setting again. You've somehow survived another day. Though survived might be too generous a word for what you're doing. You're not surviving so much as taking a very long time to die. And you watch the light fade from the slice of sky visible between buildings and wonder if you'll see another sunrise, or if tonight is finally the night your body gives up completely. Night falls and the temperature drops and you're shivering uncontrollably. Your body trying to generate heat, but having no reserves to draw on, no fuel left to burn. And the shivering itself uses energy you don't have, creating a feedback loop where the attempt to stay warm actually accelerates your decline. You drift in and out of consciousness, your brain shutting down and rebooting randomly. And during the conscious moments you have strange clarity, understanding things you didn't understand before. Seeing connections that were always there but that you were too busy surviving to notice. Like how the factory system isn't actually about making cloth. It's about making money by destroying humans. The cloth is just the excuse, the mechanism. But the real product is wealth extraction from suffering. You see a rat, or maybe you hallucinate a rat, hard to tell at this point. And it's sitting near you watching, waiting, nature's cleanup crew preparing to do its job. And you think about how rats will inherit the earth after humans destroy themselves. How they're patient and adaptable and perfectly designed for survival in the ruins we're creating. Someone is screaming somewhere, maybe in another alley, maybe in a factory, maybe in your head. And the scream goes on and on and on. And you realize it might be you screaming, might be your voice expressing what your conscious mind has been too polite to acknowledge. That this is intolerable, that no human should endure this, that the system that creates this suffering is not civilization, but its opposite. The cold is intense now, penetrating, and you can't feel your extremities anymore. Your hands and feet have gone completely numb, which is actually a relief because at least they don't hurt. And you understand that this is hypothermia setting in, that your body is conserving heat for essential organs, sacrificing the periphery to protect the core. And this will work for a while, but eventually the core will fail too, and then it's over. You think about the factory, about that building full of machines and suffering, and you realize it's still running right now. Even as you're dying, the night shift is in there working. Children are crawling under looms, workers are losing fingers, overseers are cracking whips, and it never stops. The factory never sleeps. It's a 24-hour operation that consumes humans around the clock. And your death won't even cause a hiccup in production, won't even be noticed except as a position that needs filling. Your breathing has become shallow and irregular. Your lungs can't expand properly because of the broken ribs and the cotton dust damage, and the fluid that's probably accumulating from infection. And each breath is a conscious effort, a decision to take one more. And you're starting to question whether it's worth the effort, whether breathing is really worth the work it requires, when all it does is prolong suffering. You see lights, not external lights, but something in your brain, firing neurons, creating patterns that look like stars or sparks. And you wonder if this is what dying looks like from the inside. If this light show is your consciousness breaking down, memories being deleted, systems shutting down in sequence. And there's something almost beautiful about it, almost peaceful. Except for the continued awareness that you're 20-something years old and you shouldn't be dying. That this isn't natural causes. This is murder by economic system. This is death by capitalism. And someone should be held accountable, but nobody will be. A church bell rings somewhere, counting hours. You lose track of the number. Time has become meaningless anyway. What does it matter if it's midnight or 3 a.m. or dawn? You're dying at the same rate regardless of what the clock says. You think about that little girl from the factory, the one with the crushed finger who was next to you. And you wonder if she's dead yet, if she survived the blood poisoning, or if she's lying in some other alley or workhouse infirmary dying just like you. And you hope she's not scared. Hope that if she's dying, she at least has someone with her. But you know she probably doesn't. Probably she's alone, like you're alone, because industrial poverty isolates everyone, turns death into a solitary experience. Your heart is doing strange things, beating irregularly, skipping beats. And you understand that this is the beginning of the end. That your circulatory system is failing, that soon your brain won't get enough oxygen and you'll lose consciousness permanently. And that will be it. That will be how your story ends. Not with revolution or redemption, but with organ failure in an alley, anonymous and unmourned. Just another data point in the hidden cost of the Industrial Revolution. Your last conscious thoughts are surprisingly mundane, not profound revelations about life or death, but simple observations about discomfort, about how the cobblestones are digging into your hip, about how you wish you had a blanket, about how thirsty you are. And maybe this is what death actually is, not a grand exit, but a series of small discomforts that eventually add up to nothing, to the absence of everything, including discomfort. You remember reading once, back when you could read, back when you had time for such luxuries, about how sailors who die at sea get buried with ceremony, their bodies wrapped in canvas and sent into the ocean with words spoken over them. And you think about how your death will have no ceremony, no words, no witness except maybe that rat who's still waiting patiently. And you find yourself envying dead sailors, envying anyone whose death is acknowledged as mattering, as being worth marking with ritual. There's a part of your brain that's still doing calculations, still trying to solve the problem of survival, even though the problem is clearly unsolvable. And this part is reviewing your mistakes, wondering if you should have gone to the workhouse, should have accepted the criminal's offer, should have done something different at some point. But you know this is futile because all your options were bad. The system doesn't offer good choices to people like you. It only offers various flavors of suffering, and you picked one flavor and it killed you. But any other flavor would have killed you too. Maybe faster, maybe slower, but the destination was always the same. You think about the factory owner, about his comfortable house with its gardens and clean windows, and you wonder if he thinks about workers like you, if he knows how many people have died to make his wealth possible, if he cares. And you realize he probably doesn't think about you at all. You're not real to him. You're just a line in a ledger, a cost of doing business. And his indifference is somehow worse than active cruelty because at least cruelty acknowledges your existence as a being capable of suffering, whereas indifference doesn't even grant you that. Indifference treats you as scenery, as background noise in someone else's prosperity. The distinction between sleeping and dying is getting harder to make. You keep sliding from one to the other, consciousness fading and returning. And each time it returns, there's less of you, less memory, less awareness. Like someone is gradually turning down the lights in a room that was already pretty dim. And you're not scared exactly, more resigned, accepting. This is just what happens. This is how it ends. And fear requires energy you don't have anyway. You hear the factory whistle in the distance, signaling shift change, and you think about all those workers who are still there, still working, still trading their bodies for pennies. And you want to warn them, want to tell them that this is where it leads, that the promised prosperity is a lie, that the system is designed to consume them just like it consumed you. But you can't speak, can't move, can't do anything except lie here and fade. And besides, they probably know already. Probably they've seen this happen to others. Probably they're just hoping they'll be lucky. That somehow they'll be the exception, the one who makes it through intact. There's a moment of clarity, brief and sharp, where you understand that your death is actually political, that it's not natural or inevitable, but the result of specific choices made by specific people who valued profit over human life. And this understanding makes you angry, gives you one last surge of feeling. But anger requires sustained energy, and you don't have that. So the anger flares and dies almost immediately, leaving only the cold and the dark and the fading. Your last thought, the very last one before consciousness leaves permanently, is surprisingly ordinary. You're thinking about bread, about how good that meat pie tasted, about simple food and simple pleasures. And maybe this is appropriate. Maybe we're all just animals in the end. And an animal's last thoughts are about basic needs, about hunger and warmth and comfort, not about philosophy or justice or the meaning of life. Just about bread. Just about wanting one more bite of something good before the darkness takes over completely. The darkness does take over, gently, without drama. Your heart stops not with a final great beat, but with a diminishing rhythm. Slower, weaker, until it just stops. And the cold of death is indistinguishable from the cold of the alley. And your body becomes indistinguishable from the garbage around it. And Manchester continues its business, factories running, people working, the great machine grinding forward over your corpse and the corpses of thousands like you. Building an empire on broken bodies, creating wealth from suffering, and calling it progress, calling it civilization, calling it the natural order of things, when really it's just murder dressed up in economic theory. Your body is discovered 3 days later by a street sweeper who almost mistakes you for a pile of rags. And when he realizes you're human, or were human, he sighs with the weary resignation of someone who finds dead factory workers so regularly that it's just part of his morning routine. And he marks the location and moves on to report it to the authorities, who will eventually collect your corpse and dispose of it with the efficiency of a city that has systematized the removal of industrial casualties. The coroner who examines your body doesn't record your name because nobody knows it. Doesn't record cause of death beyond vague notation about infection and exposure. Doesn't investigate who employed you or under what conditions. Doesn't ask any questions that might implicate the economic system in your death. Because the coroner's job isn't to challenge capitalism. It's to categorize corpses. And yours gets categorized as pauper death by natural causes, which is technically true if you define natural causes broadly enough to include the natural consequences of unregulated industrial employment. Your body is transported to a mass grave on the outskirts of Manchester, a pit where hundreds of workers are buried without markers, without ceremony, without anything to distinguish your remains from the remains of all the others who were used up and discarded by the same system. And the men who shovel dirt over you are themselves factory workers doing this as side work, earning extra pennies by burying their future selves. And they don't see the irony. Or maybe they do see it and just can't afford to care. The factory where you worked operates uninterrupted by your death. Your position was filled within hours by another desperate worker who walked through the same gates, climbed the same stairs, stood at the same loom, and began the same process of self-destruction that claimed you. And the overseer who fired you doesn't remember your face, doesn't think about you at all. You were just one worker among hundreds, indistinguishable, forgettable, already replaced. The owner of the factory reads his quarterly reports and sees that profits are up. Productivity is increasing, costs are being managed effectively, and he's pleased. Toasts his success with expensive wine in his comfortable home, never making the connection between his prosperity and your corpse in the ground, never understanding or caring that every percentage point of increased profit represents a human cost, represents suffering and maiming and death, represents you dying alone in an alley thinking about bread. The government receives reports of worker deaths, sees the numbers accumulating, thousands per year, and discusses the matter in Parliament. And some members argue for reform, for safety regulations, for limits on working hours, for protections for children. But others argue that such regulations would harm economic growth, would make British industry less competitive, would interfere with the natural relationship between capital and labor. And the reformers lose because capital has more representatives than labor does, because money speaks louder than suffering in the halls of power. A journalist writes an article about conditions in cotton mills, includes statistics about injuries and deaths, describes the suffering with eloquent prose, publishes it in a newspaper that's read by people who consider themselves enlightened and progressive. And these readers tut-tut over their morning tea about how terrible the situation is, how something should be done. And then they go about their days wearing clothes made in those same mills, benefiting from the cheap goods produced by workers like you, their comfort subsidized by suffering. And they can acknowledge intellectually, while remaining emotionally distant from, because the suffering happens out of sight. In buildings they never enter, to people they never meet. Your family, if you had family, never learns what happened to you. You simply disappeared into the industrial machine and never emerged. And they probably imagine various scenarios. Maybe you found success, maybe you died, maybe you're still out there somewhere, and they'll never know the truth, never know that you died for nothing, that your sacrifice bought them nothing, that your suffering served only to marginally enrich people who never knew your name. The little girl who worked next to you also died, 3 days after you, from the same blood poisoning that killed you, and her body is in the same mass grave, somewhere near yours, though the exact locations are unknowable. And in death you're together in a way you never were in life, united by the shared experience of being consumed by the same system. 2 among thousands, thousands among millions. All of you feeding the great machine, all of you ground up to fuel someone else's progress, someone else's civilization, someone else's dream of prosperity that required your nightmare to function. The worker who replaced you lasts 2 weeks before losing 3 fingers to the same machine that injured you. And she's fired immediately, replaced by yet another desperate soul who will last some amount of time before being broken and discarded. And this cycle continues endlessly. The factory consuming hundreds of workers per year, thousands over its operational life. Each one believing they'll be different. Each one learning too late that the system doesn't make exceptions, doesn't allow for hope, doesn't reward anything except the ownership class who never set foot on the factory floor. The reforms that eventually come decades later will be too late for you. Too late for everyone who died in these early years of industrialization. You're the price paid for progress that you never benefit from. You're the sacrifice that makes future worker protections possible. Your suffering creates the evidence that eventually becomes too overwhelming to ignore. But this is cold comfort to your corpse rotting in anonymous ground. Cold comfort to the life you never got to live. The children you never had, the old age you never reached, all of it stolen to fuel someone else's prosperity. The factory itself will stand for over a century, outliving everyone who worked in it during your time, outliving the owner who profited from your death, outliving the system that created it, eventually becoming a historical landmark, a place where tourists come to photograph Victorian architecture and maybe read a placard about industrial heritage. And nobody who visits will think about the blood in the mortar, the suffering in the bricks, the thousands of lives ground up to build this monument to economic progress. The economic system that killed you spreads globally. The British model of industrialization becoming the template for developing nations, and workers around the world will experience variations of what you experienced. Factories in Asia and Africa and South America consuming human bodies to produce cheap goods for wealthy consumers in developed nations. The same pattern repeating across centuries and continents. Capital requiring sacrifice. Progress demanding victims. Prosperity built on pyramids of corpses that nobody wants to acknowledge or count. There are economists who will write about this era, who will calculate the efficiency gains, the productivity increases, the economic growth, and they'll mention the human cost in footnotes if they mention it at all. Treating worker deaths as an unfortunate but necessary externality, the price of progress, the cost of doing business, and they'll never mention you specifically because you're not important to the calculations. You're just a data point, a statistic, a unit of labor that was consumed in the production process. And the fact that you were human, that you had hopes and fears and dreams, that you died in agony thinking about bread. None of this matters to economic theory. None of this appears in the models. The cotton produced by your factory gets turned into cloth. The cloth gets turned into clothing. The clothing gets worn by people who never think about where it came from, who never consider that the shirt on their back cost someone their health or life, who benefit from the system of exploitation without understanding their complicity in it. And this is how capitalism works. It separates production from consumption, hides the suffering from the beneficiaries, creates supply chains long enough that nobody has to think about the human cost of their comfort. Your death changes nothing and everything. Changes nothing because the factory continues operation, the system continues functioning, capital continues accumulating. Changes everything because you're one more piece of evidence. One more data point in the argument that eventually leads to reform, to regulation, to labor laws and safety standards, and the gradual recognition that maybe, possibly, workers are humans whose lives have value beyond their productive capacity. Though this recognition comes slowly, reluctantly, always fighting against the argument that protecting workers hurts economic growth. That caring about humans is expensive and inefficient. There's a monument eventually, not to you specifically, but to all the workers who died in Manchester's mills, a small plaque in a park that most people walk past without reading. And if you could see it, you might laugh or cry or feel nothing, because what does a monument mean when you're dead? What does recognition matter when it comes 100 years too late? What good are apologies from future generations who still benefit from the system that killed you? Who still wear cheap clothes made in factories that exploit workers in countries where regulations haven't caught up? Where the same cycle continues. Different location, same suffering. The truth that your death teaches, the lesson that nobody wants to learn, is that economic systems are not neutral, are not natural laws like gravity or thermodynamics, but human creations that reflect human choices, and a system that requires human sacrifice to function is not inevitable or necessary, but chosen, maintained, defended by people who benefit from it. And your death was not tragic accident or natural disaster, but the predictable, preventable result of valuing profit over human life, efficiency over dignity, growth over justice. And until this fundamental equation changes, until human life becomes more valuable than productivity, until capitalism is forced to account for its casualties rather than externalizing them. Your death will keep repeating. Different names, different faces, same story, same preventable tragedy, same choice to let people die rather than reduce profits. But let's pull back from your specific death, from your individual tragedy, and look at the broader picture, at what a day as a Victorian factory worker actually meant in the context of the entire industrial system. Because your story, while unique in its details, was tragically common in its outline. Repeated thousands of times across Manchester, across Britain, across the industrializing world. And understanding this pattern helps explain why the Industrial Revolution, for all its technological marvels and economic growth, was built on a foundation of systematic human destruction that we're still grappling with today. The average Victorian factory worker could expect to live to about 40 years old, compared to 60 plus for the wealthy class. And this 30-year gap wasn't genetic or natural. It was entirely the result of working conditions, of environments designed to maximize productivity rather than preserve human life, of economic calculations that treated workers as disposable resources rather than humans worthy of protection. And this life expectancy gap was as predictable and engineered as any machine on the factory floor. Just another output of the industrial system. The injuries you sustained, the infections that killed you, weren't unusual or bad luck. They were the statistical norm, the expected outcome of factory work. And factory owners knew this, insurers knew this, doctors knew this. Everyone involved in the system understood that hiring a factory worker was effectively signing their death warrant. It was just a question of how long they'd last before the system consumed them completely. And this knowledge was built into wage calculations, into hiring practices, into every aspect of industrial management. The children working in factories, and there were hundreds of thousands of them, started as young as 5 years old in some cases, and they'd work until their bodies broke, usually by their teens. And then they'd either die or transition into adult poverty, having never experienced childhood, never learned to read, never developed any skills beyond operating machinery. And this wasn't accidental. This was policy. Because child labor was cheaper and more controllable. And because a system based on maximum extraction doesn't stop at adults when children can be exploited too. The hours you worked, 14 to 16 per day, 6 days per week, were standard across most factories. And this schedule was deliberately designed to occupy all of workers' waking hours, leaving no time for education, for organizing, for developing skills that might allow escape, for anything except work and bare minimum recovery before the next shift. And this temporal imprisonment was as effective as any physical prison in maintaining the system, because exhausted people don't revolt, don't organize, don't have the energy to imagine alternatives. They just survive day to day, hoping to make it through one more shift. The wages you earned, 3 shillings per week before deductions, were calculated precisely to keep you desperate. To be just enough that you'd keep showing up, but never enough to save money, to improve your situation, to escape the trap. And this wage calculation wasn't arbitrary. It was deliberate policy because workers with savings are workers with options. And workers with options can demand better conditions, and better conditions cost money. So the solution was to keep wages at subsistence level, ensuring constant desperation, constant compliance, constant availability of bodies willing to accept any conditions rather than starve. The fines and deductions that reduced your actual take-home pay were another control mechanism. Arbitrary punishments for lateness or imperfect work or breaking unstated rules, all designed to keep workers in debt to the factory. To create a system where you owed the company store more than you earned. Where leaving meant not just losing income, but being pursued for debt. Where the factory owned not just your labor, but your future, your freedom, your entire economic existence. The company housing, when it existed, was another trap. Overcrowded rooms rented at inflated prices, creating dependencies that made leaving impossible. And when you lost housing as you did, it was intentional design, not accidental failure. Because homeless workers are even more desperate than housed workers, even more willing to accept terrible conditions, even less likely to complain or organize or demand better treatment. The lack of safety equipment, the exposed machinery, the absence of guards or shields or any protection. This wasn't oversight or temporary condition waiting for improvement. This was permanent feature of the system. Because safety costs money and dead workers can be replaced cheaper than machines can be safeguarded. And factory owners did this math explicitly, calculated the cost of safety versus the cost of replacement workers, and replacement workers won every time because human life was cheaper than iron guards, more disposable than wooden shields, more expendable than any piece of equipment. The legal framework surrounding factory work in 1853 was deliberately structured to protect capital rather than labor, with laws that made it nearly impossible for workers to sue for injuries or seek compensation for deaths, with courts that consistently ruled in favor of employers, with a justice system that treated worker complaints as nuisances and factory owner negligence as acceptable business practice. And this legal architecture wasn't accidental or historical artifact. It was constructed intentionally by politicians who were themselves factory owners or invested in industrial enterprises, by legislators who had direct financial stakes in maintaining the system exactly as it was, by judges who came from the same social class as the factory owners and shared their fundamental belief that property rights mattered more than human rights. The medical establishment of the time understood the health consequences of factory work. Doctors wrote papers about cotton lung and industrial injuries and the elevated mortality rates. But this knowledge didn't translate into protection for workers because the medical establishment served wealthy patients who paid well, not factory workers who couldn't afford treatment, and there was no economic incentive to challenge the system. No professional advantage to advocating for people who couldn't pay for advocacy. So the medical knowledge existed in academic journals and private conversations, but never resulted in policy changes or factory improvements, because knowledge without power is just documentation of suffering rather than prevention of suffering. The religious institutions that might have challenged this exploitation were mostly complicit in maintaining it, with churches preaching that suffering in this life would be rewarded in the next, that poverty was God's will, that workers should accept their station without complaint. And this religious justification for industrial capitalism was incredibly effective because it transformed economic exploitation into divine plan, made resistance seem not just futile, but sinful, and kept workers focused on heavenly reward rather than earthly justice. And the churches benefited from this arrangement through donations from wealthy factory owners who were happy to fund religious institutions that preached submission to authority. The emerging labor movement, the early unions and workers' associations that tried to organize for better conditions, faced violent suppression from both private security forces and government police. with strikes being broken up by force, with organizers being arrested or beaten or simply disappearing, with any attempt at collective action being crushed before it could build momentum. And this suppression was legal, was officially sanctioned, was considered legitimate use of force to maintain order and protect property rights. Because the state existed to protect capital, not labor. And when workers tried to change the system, they discovered that the system included armed forces explicitly designed to prevent that change. The idea that workers had rights, that employers had responsibilities beyond paying minimal wages, that human dignity mattered more than profit margins. These concepts existed in philosophy and radical politics, but had no legal standing, no institutional support, no mechanism for enforcement, because the entire structure of industrial society was built on the assumption that capital was sacred and labor was expendable, that machines deserved protection, but humans deserved only what they could extract through their own desperate bargaining from position of complete powerlessness. The education system ensured that most workers remained illiterate, unable to read contracts or wage calculations or news about organizing efforts. Because educated workers are dangerous workers. Workers who can read, can learn their rights, can communicate with each other, can organize effectively, can challenge the narratives that justify their exploitation. So keeping workers illiterate was fundamental to maintaining control. And the fact schedule that consumed all waking hours made education impossible anyway. Even for workers who wanted to learn, there was simply no time, no energy, no access to books or teachers or any path toward knowledge that might threaten the system. The narrative that justified all of this, the story that society told itself to make mass suffering acceptable, was that factories were actually improving workers' lives compared to rural poverty, that industrial employment was opportunity rather than exploitation, that workers were better off in factories than they would be on farms or in traditional crafts. And there was some truth to this. Rural poverty was brutal in its own ways. But this narrative ignored that the choice between different types of suffering isn't really a choice, isn't evidence of progress, isn't justification for accepting conditions that destroy human bodies and spirits. The fact that factories were slightly better than starvation doesn't make them good, doesn't make the suffering they caused acceptable, doesn't absolve the system of responsibility for the casualties it created. The technological marvels of the Industrial Revolution, the steam engines and power looms and mechanical innovations that historians celebrate, were all built on this foundation of human suffering. Were all subsidized by workers who paid with their bodies. And you can't separate the technology from the system that produced it. Can't celebrate industrial progress without acknowledging industrial casualties. Can't call it civilization when civilization requires sacrificing humans to machines. When progress is measured in productivity rather than well-being. When the cost of advancement is paid by people who never benefit from the advancement they make possible. The psychological damage of factory work extended beyond the physical injuries. Workers developed what we'd now recognize as PTSD, depression, anxiety disorders, all the mental health consequences of sustained trauma. But Victorian society had no framework for understanding mental illness in the working class. No treatment available even if they'd recognized the problem. And workers experiencing psychological breakdown were simply labeled as mad or lazy, and either worked until they physically couldn't continue, or were sent to asylums that were arguably worse than factories. places where the mad poor were stored rather than treated, where mental illness was punished rather than addressed, where another kind of industrial system processed human suffering into institutional efficiency. The social isolation of factory work, despite being surrounded by hundreds of other workers, was profound and deliberate, because workers who formed connections could organize, could support each other, could build solidarity that threatened the system. So everything about factory design worked against community. The noise made conversation impossible. The pace made interaction difficult. The constant turnover of fired and replaced workers prevented lasting relationships. The competition for positions and fear of being replaced created distrust. And workers ended up alone together, surrounded by people but fundamentally isolated, unable to form the bonds that might let them collectively resist. The loss of craft and skill that industrialization represented meant that workers went from being artisans with valuable knowledge to being machine operators with replaceable functions. And this de-skilling was intentional, was part of the system's design, because skilled workers have leverage, can bargain based on expertise, can't be easily replaced, whereas unskilled workers can be swapped out instantly, can be treated as interchangeable parts in the industrial machine. And breaking down craft into simple, repetitive tasks wasn't just about efficiency. It was about power, about ensuring that no worker was necessary, that everyone was disposable, that the system could function with complete indifference to individual workers because individuals didn't matter. Only the mass mattered. Only the continuous supply of bodies willing to work. The gender dynamics in factories added another layer of exploitation, with women workers earning roughly half what men earned for the same work, with sexual harassment and assault being common and unpunished, with women having even less legal recourse than men when injured or abused, with the additional burden of being expected to maintain households and care for children while working the same brutal hours as male workers. And this gendered exploitation wasn't incidental or unfortunate side effect. It was built into the wage structures, into the hiring practices, into the social assumptions that women's work was worth less than men's work, even when it was identical work, and women workers faced the impossible choice between accepting exploitation in factories or accepting different exploitation in domestic service or sex work, with no option available that didn't involve trading dignity and health for survival. The children who worked in factories, and we should return to them because their situation was somehow even worse than adults, not only faced the same dangers and exhaustion, but did so in bodies that were still developing. So the damage was more severe, more permanent, stunted growth and deformed bones and respiratory systems that never properly formed. And the work prevented them from playing, from learning, from experiencing anything resembling childhood. And Victorian society knew this was happening, knew that industrial capitalism was consuming its children, but chose to allow it anyway, because the economic benefits to factory owners outweighed the moral concerns about destroying young lives, because children were cheaper than adult workers and more easily controlled and more desperate because their families needed their wages. And a system that eats its children isn't a civilization. It's a death cult pretending to be an economy. The connection between your death and the clothes on wealthy people's backs was direct and obvious, but successfully obscured through the magic of market economics, where supply chains become long enough and abstract enough that consumers never have to think about production, never have to confront the human cost of their comfort. never have to acknowledge that their cheap shirts were expensive to someone, that their convenience required someone else's suffering, that the system that benefited them was the same system that killed you. And this obscuring of connection, this separation of consumption from production, this ability to benefit from exploitation without witnessing it. This is how industrial capitalism maintains itself, how it continues consuming humans while the beneficiaries remain blissfully or willfully ignorant of the cost. The factory owners themselves weren't monsters in the traditional sense, weren't cartoon villains cackling over workers' suffering. They were ordinary people who'd internalized a system that valued profit over human life, who genuinely believed that what they were doing was progress, was civilization, was the natural order of economics. And this is perhaps more frightening than simple evil, because it means the system didn't require bad people to function. It just required people who accepted its values, who internalized its logic, who stopped seeing workers as fully human and started seeing them as economic units, as costs to be minimized, as resources to be exploited. And once you accept that framework, once you internalize that logic, then every decision that hurts workers becomes rational, becomes necessary, becomes just good business. And this brings us to the uncomfortable present, because while conditions have improved, while we have safety regulations and labor laws and unions and workplace protections, while we no longer see children losing fingers in textile mills in Manchester, the fundamental dynamic hasn't changed as much as we'd like to believe. Capital still seeks to extract maximum value from labor at minimum cost. Profit still competes with human well-being, and the only difference is that now the worst exploitation happens in countries where regulations are weak and workers are desperate, and global supply chains obscure the connection between consumption and suffering, just like Victorian supply chains did. The smartphone in your pocket was probably assembled by workers in conditions that would have been familiar to you in that Manchester factory. Long hours, low wages, exposure to toxic chemicals, surveillance and control, minimal safety equipment, the suicide nets around the factory dormitories serving the same function as the locked doors in Victorian mills, preventing escape from conditions designed to maximize productivity regardless of human cost. The clothes you wear, the cheap, fast fashion that democratized style, are produced in factories in Bangladesh and Vietnam and China where workers, mostly young women, work 14-hour shifts in buildings that sometimes collapse, that sometimes catch fire, where exits are locked and safety equipment is absent, and workers who try to organize for better conditions face the same violent suppression that Victorian workers faced. Because the system that exploits them benefits us. And we've externalized the suffering the same way Victorian consumers did. Put it far enough away that we don't have to see it, don't have to think about it, can enjoy the products without confronting the production. The gig economy, the platform capitalism that promises flexibility and entrepreneurship, is just factory work with a smartphone app. Same precarity, same lack of benefits, same constant surveillance, same race to the bottom on wages, same shift of all risk onto workers while profit flows upward. And the companies running these platforms use the same arguments Victorian factory owners used. That workers are free to leave if they don't like the conditions. That regulation will harm innovation and growth. That this is just how markets work. That any protection for workers will hurt the economy. And these arguments worked then, and they work now, because we haven't fundamentally changed the relationship between capital and labor. We've just moved it around geographically and technologically. The climate crisis is the Industrial Revolution's final bill coming due. The accumulated consequence of a system that externalized environmental costs the same way it externalized human costs, that treated the atmosphere as a free dumping ground the same way it treated workers as disposable resources. And the workers who will suffer most from climate change are the same populations who suffer most from labor exploitation. The global poor who contributed least to the problem but will pay the highest price. Just as Victorian factory workers paid the price for industrial growth they didn't benefit from. The COVID pandemic revealed how little has changed. Essential workers forced to risk their lives for poverty wages, denied basic protections, sacrificed to keep the economy running, treated as expendable in service of profit, and the language used to justify this. The talk of necessary sacrifice and economic necessity was identical to the language used to justify Victorian factory conditions. And millions of people died preventable deaths because the system still values productivity over human life, still treats workers as resources to be consumed rather than humans to be protected. The reforms that did happen, the improvements we celebrate, came only through sustained worker organizing, through strikes and protests and political action, through workers literally dying to force change. And every protection workers have today was fought for against violent opposition from capital, was won over the dead bodies of organizers and activists, was conceded only when the cost of suppression exceeded the cost of reform. And capital is constantly working to roll back these protections, to claw back concessions, to return to conditions where profit has no constraints, where human cost is fully externalized, where the Victorian factory model can operate without the inconvenience of safety regulations or labor laws. The fundamental question that your death poses, the question that Victorian industrialization forces us to confront, is whether a system that requires human sacrifice to function is actually progress. Whether economic growth that's built on mass suffering represents civilization or just sophisticated barbarism. Whether we can have prosperity without exploitation, or if capitalism intrinsically requires some population to be ground up so others can benefit. And this isn't abstract philosophy. This is practical question about how we organize society, about whose life matters, about whether we're willing to acknowledge that the comfortable life we enjoy is subsidized by suffering. We've simply moved out of sight, and until we confront this question honestly, until we're willing to restructure systems that treat humans as disposable, your death and the millions like it will continue. Different names, different places, same preventable tragedy, same choice to value profit over people, same system grinding forward over human bodies and calling it progress. So here we are, at the end of this journey through one day as a Victorian factory worker. Except it wasn't just one day. It was 3 days that destroyed a life, that took a human being with hopes and dreams and turned them into a corpse in an unmarked grave. And the real horror isn't the physical suffering, as terrible as that was, but the casual acceptance of it. The way the system treated human destruction as normal, acceptable, just the cost of doing business, and the way that basic attitude persists today, despite all our supposed progress and enlightenment. You wouldn't have survived a day as a Victorian factory worker, not if you're coming from modern life with its safety standards and labor protections and basic respect for human dignity. You'd walk into that factory, and within hours you'd understand that you were in hell. That this wasn't work, but systematic destruction. That nobody could sustain those conditions. That the question wasn't whether you'd be broken, but how long you'd last before breaking became fatal. But people did survive, or rather, they died slowly, trading their bodies piece by piece for wages that barely sustained life. And they did this not because they were stronger or tougher than modern people, but because they had no choice. Because the alternative to factory work was starvation. Because the system was designed to give them just enough hope to keep showing up while making sure they never had enough security to leave. And this trap, this carefully calibrated desperation, was the real innovation of the Industrial Revolution. Not the steam engine, but the perfection of systematic human exploitation. The lessons we should learn from this history, the understanding we should take away, aren't comfortable or reassuring. They don't support narratives of inevitable progress or the triumph of capitalism. Instead, they reveal that the prosperity we enjoy was built on mass suffering, that the technologies we celebrate were subsidized by human sacrifice, that the economic system we've inherited is fundamentally predicated on someone somewhere being exploited so others can benefit. And acknowledging this doesn't mean rejecting modernity or calling for return to pre-industrial life. But it does mean confronting the reality that progress isn't linear or universal, that advancement for some requires sacrifice from others, that until we restructure the basic relationship between capital and labor, we're just moving the suffering around rather than eliminating it. The factory worker dying in that Manchester alley, thinking about bread, deserves more than historical footnote or sympathetic clucking, deserves more than being reduced to cautionary tale or evidence in argument about past injustices. That person deserves recognition as human being whose life mattered, whose suffering was real, whose death was preventable, whose story is not past tense, but continuing present in factories and warehouses and platforms around the world, where workers are still being consumed by systems that value profit over human life. And the only way to honor that death is to actually change the systems that caused it, rather than just memorializing the casualties they create. The uncomfortable truth is that most of us are more like the Victorian consumers reading newspaper articles about factory conditions over morning tea than we are like the factory workers dying in the mills. We benefit from global systems of exploitation while maintaining comfortable distance from the suffering those systems require. We wear cheap clothes and use cheap electronics and enjoy cheap goods without thinking too much about the cheap labor that made them possible. And this ignorance is maintained not through active deception, but through passive acceptance of supply chains designed to obscure their human cost. Through economic systems structured to separate consumption from production. Through social frameworks that let us care about injustice in abstract, while benefiting from it in concrete. So what does it mean to truly understand what a day as a Victorian factory worker was like? What does it mean to really comprehend the suffering we've explored through these chapters? It means recognizing that history isn't safely in the past, that the patterns we've examined aren't artifacts, but active systems, that the choice between valuing human life and valuing profit is one we're still making every day through policy and purchasing and political priorities. And until we choose differently, until we actually restructure our economic relationships to prioritize human well-being over capital accumulation, we're not learning from history. We're just repeating it with better technology and more sophisticated justifications. You wouldn't survive a day as a Victorian factory worker, because no one should have to. Because conditions that destroy human bodies and spirits aren't acceptable in any era. Because the fact that this happened, that millions of people lived and died in these conditions, that society allowed it and profited from it and justified it. This should horrify us, not just as historical curiosity, but as indictment of systems we've inherited and modified, but never fundamentally challenged. And that horror, if we let it actually land, should motivate not just sympathy for past suffering, but action to prevent future suffering. Should push us to build economic systems that actually value human life rather than just claim to while grinding people up in service of profit. Should remind us that progress isn't what technology can do, but what society chooses to do with that technology. And right now, we're choosing pretty much the same thing Victorian industrialists chose, just with better PR and more geographical distance between beneficiaries and casualties. And that's not progress. That's just more sophisticated exploitation. And we can do better. We must do better. Or your death in that Manchester alley. And the millions of deaths like it mean nothing, teach nothing, change nothing, and the great machine keeps grinding forward over human bodies while we call it civilization and look away.